Stoic Wisdom. Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. By Nancy Sherman. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Lesson 6 Healing Through Self-Compassion, Stoic Warriors. Lesson 7 Lifehacks. Lesson 8 The Art of Stoic Living. Lesson 9 A Healthy Modern Stoicism. Lesson 6 Healing Through Self-Compassion. Stoic Warriors. Stockdale and the Stoic Culture of the Military. Just 3 weeks after the 9th of November, I flew to San Diego to interview Admiral James Stockdale. I was a bit anxious about flying. We had dropped off our daughter 2 weeks earlier at Dulles for her studies abroad in France. The airport was a ghost city, but Stockdale and I had planned this interview months ago. I was going forward with it. I had met him a few times before at Navy speaking events. In fact, I had given the Stockdale lecture at the University of San Diego in his honor. I knew of his legendary status within the military, and especially at the U.S. Naval Academy. He had left a deep Stoic imprint there. Stoicism lived and breathed through Stockdale. What I didn't know until that morning at his home in Coronado was that, years after retirement, he was still channeling Epictetus. He still had most of the Enchiridion memorized. It remained a source of his resilience. Shot down over North Vietnam on September 9, 1965, James Bond Stockdale, then a senior Navy pilot, muttered prescient words to himself as he parachuted into enemy hands, 5 years down there, at least. I'm leaving behind the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. A Stanford philosophy professor and dean, Philip Rhinelander, had given Stockdale the Enchiridion as a small gift upon starting his mid-career master's degree there. Stockdale was skeptical about the gift. He confessed to me, "What would a martini-drinking, golf-playing, naval aviator like myself do with a book like that?" And yet the nights were long on the USS Ticonderoga and then the USS Oriskany in the Pacific. Epictetus's slim handbook became his wardroom companion. He committed it to memory. He summoned up its teachings the moment he ejected from his A4 Skyhawk. When he hit the ground, a street gang pummeled him. That beating and more that would follow left his left leg badly broken, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. When we met, he still couldn't bend the leg. And so, we sat at the dining room table with room for his leg to jut out straight. That was part of his connection with Epictetus. He, too, had a lame leg, either congenitally or from beatings in enslavement. I mentioned the uncanny coincidence and he shot back Epictetus at me, in a kind of James Cagney voice that was Stockdale's own. Lameness is an impediment to the leg, not to the will, and say this to yourself with regard to everything that happens. For you will find such things to be an impediment to something else, but not truly to yourself. Epictetus taught that you can rule yourself, even as an enslaved person. Stockdale internalized that lesson during his 7.5 years as the senior prisoner of war in the North Vietnam HOA Low Prison, or Hanoi Hilton, as it was dubbed by the POWs, for years of which he spent in solitary confinement, and 2 years in leg irons. One fellow POW whose cell was 2 doors down from Stockdale's was John McCain, who would go on to become a senator from Arizona. As the highest-ranking officer, Stockdale took charge of the internal chain of command of POWs. Taking the ropes became the euphemism for the sustained and methodical torture they all were to endure. Confession was the end goal for the torturer. Punishment for the crimes of being the treacherous enemy was 6 or 8 more weeks of isolation. Stockdale's orders to his fellow prisoners was Epictetan. My mindset was, we here under the gun are the experts, we are masters of our fate. He wasn't going to issue guilt-inducing hollow edicts, or reiterate government policy of giving name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, that had no chance of standing up in the torture room. The message would be clear and would be the backbone of resistance and collective survival. The principal order had to be an easy-to-remember acronym. He settled on, back US. Don't bow in public, stay off the air, admit no crimes, never kiss them goodbye. The US was the United States, but really it meant, he stressed, unity over self. It's always we, not alone. They were still a cadre fighting a war, this one a war of wills, and he was the leader of the expatriate colony. In all this, Epictetus guided him. Harm was not a broken back or leg but the guilt and shame of betrayal of the self and group. Harm was underestimating self-mastery and authority. Harm was mistaking the taste of a cigarette or a night out of leg irons for real autonomy. Harm was forgetting the power of wily reason in resisting the torturer's will. These core Stoic thoughts, attitude-shaping remarks, he called them, were survival tools in prison. They were still with him close to 40 years later. Here's Epictetus on how to stay off the hook. He then rattled off Epictetus. A man's master is he who is able to confer or remove whatever that man seeks or shuns. Whoever then would be free, let him wish nothing, let him decline nothing, which depends on others, else he must necessarily be a slave. The enslaved Roman Stoic from Phrygia was a lifeline. But so too was his wife Sibyl. They communicated in letters through secret codes and invisible ink, the stuff of espionage novels. And it was Sibyl, a fierce advocate for the POWs, who organized the families and brought international attention to the torture of POWs by the North Vietnamese and the ongoing violation of Geneva Accords. Her dining room table in Coronado became the hub of tireless activity for many of the POW wives for whom the Pentagon's keep quiet policy was no longer acceptable. She made repeated trips to Washington, cutting through red tape to advocate on behalf of the prisoners. The release of nearly 600 POWs finally came in 1973. It was at that same dining room table that Jim and I were now talking. Sibyl was in the kitchen and overheard some of the conversation. At one point, Jim said that there was a silver lining in all those years of being a POW tortured and in leg irons. He had come to understand the true freedom that Epictetus taught. He'd do it again for that. Sibyl would have none of it. She dashed back into the dining room and took her seat at the table. If Stoicism was a religion, she'd get her religion in a different way. They were each in their own way and together indomitable forces. They supported each other in deprivation and in illness. Jim succumbed to Alzheimer's disease and died in 2004 at the age of 81. Sibyl died of Parkinson's disease, some 10 years later, at the age of 90. Stockdale bequeathed Epictetus to the Navy, and indeed to the military, of the post-Vietnam era. But Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were already long part of the military ethos. Stoicism teaches how to adapt to cruel deprivation, how to find freedom in duress, how to tutor love so what we value is integrity and not glitter. Throw a bit of glory between the closest of friends, warns Epictetus, even father and son, and they may wish for each other's death. This could be a lesson for fighters. Unit members fighting side by side for the same cause can put each other at risk to rack up medals and ribbons. Ribbon chasing in the military is glory chasing. Epictetus warns service members to spurn false glory and aspire toward real virtue. Core values of the military and the service branches, like those of the Navy, honor, courage, and commitment, mean little if the words just point to career boosters, stars and grades and conspicuous glory flashed on metals that shine on a uniform. I taught at the Naval Academy in the mid-1990s in the wake of a massive cheating scandal. I was the inaugural ethics chair, brought on board to rehabilitate 133 midshipmen who had cheated on an electrical engineering exam. I ended up staying on for several years to teach ethics and integrate ethics into the curriculum. I taught what I had long taught in my classes at Yale and Georgetown, texts drawn from Bentham and Mill, Kant and Aristotle, just war theorists, with case studies sandwiched in between. The sequence was thematic, not chronological, and we came to the Stoics fairly late in the term. But when we got there, our ship had finally arrived. I had led the 1,000 youngsters, sophomores, and junior and senior officers that were my section leaders to their philosophy. Epictetus spoke to them in a way no other philosopher could. The students already had their own version of a Stoic mantra from the moment they became plebeians. It was, suck it up and truck on. That was what you needed to survive in the military. Now Stoicism with a capital S, Epictetus channeled through Stockdale, with lessons in virtue and tough discipline, filled out the credo. Attention in the military, Stoicism and moral injury. Greco-Roman Stoicism is a natural fit for the military. Yet its intention with what many experts now acknowledge as a pervasive psychological fact of war and after war. And that is moral injury. The leading research and clinical mental health professionals working on war-related moral injury define it as a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. Transgressions can arise from the point of view of the agent, as perpetrator, from the behavior of others, as victim, or by being close-up witnesses, say as immersed war journalist or photographer. Consider Toronto Star photojournalist Paul Watson, who was in Somalia in 1993 and took the Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of Staff Sergeant William David Cleveland, a blooded corpse, bound, and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by the Somali rebels. As Watson aimed his camera, what he heard Cleveland whisper was, "If you do this, I'll own you forever." The photo ended up being instrumental in the pullout of American forces from Somalia under President Clinton. But the guilt of having taken the photo tormented Watson for decades. It was as if Watson's camera shot was one of the shots that killed Cleveland. Moral injury is a trauma response to a severe moral conflict or challenge. It's related to post-traumatic stress, points, with overlapping symptoms, yet distinct from it in that moral threat, and not overwhelming life threat, is the trigger. The potentially injurious experiences have to do with breaches of morality, not breaches of safety. The emotions that manifest moral injury can burrow deep, like guilt, shame, resentment, and a sense of betraying and being betrayed. They are part of a broader palette of emotions that philosophers call reactive attitudes. They are testaments to the fact that we hold ourselves and others to account. Service members wield the most lethal of weapons in high-stakes situations. Those who are conscientious wrestle with what they do and what they leave undone and what they leave behind. While moral injury may be especially traumatic in the military, it also exists in civilian life, even when lethal weapons aren't wielded. There are lessons to be learned for everyone in how Stoicism handles moral injury. An accidental killing. Lane McDowell was meant for a cockpit. He had wanted to fly since junior high, and the Naval Academy, unlike the Air Force, took a gamble on a guy that had just had a knee injury. He graduated in 1995 with a 3.84 GPA and soon discovered he also had the physiology to fly. He was a G-monster, able to withstand 9 Gs over time in the spin and puke centrifuge. He could physically endure and had made peace with willful self-defensive killing of enemy combatants in what he took to be just war ways. But one event early in his career unhinged his sense of moral calm. It was a midday strike on a radio relay site in northern Kosovo in May 1999. Intelligence imagery was grainy. In order not to alert Serbian forces, he had to go south of the target and make a quick turn back. Aircrews now had less time to locate and verify the target. Serbian air defense opened up fire and that took McDowell's attention away from the targeting screen. I felt good about the release. Then clouds obscured the target until about 13 seconds to impact. At that time I began having doubts about the target. It didn't look right, but in those 13 seconds, I didn't say anything, and we took out what we were targeting with 2 GBU, guided bomb unit, -12s. Dread started to mount. Back on the carrier, McDowell looked at the strike footage on a big screen. The bomb had struck not the target but a carport next to a house. McDowell saw signs of civilian occupation, and unmistakably, for bikes, 2 of which were child-sized. There were never any legal proceedings or Navy follow-up to determine if and who and how many civilians and children may have been killed in the strike. But he carried the moral burden in a repetitive intrusive dream in which he did his own after-incident investigation. The dream replayed again before he deployed to Iraq in 2005. The building he bombed was somehow still standing but there was thick dust everywhere, insulation and wires dangling, boards littered all over the ground. The smoke was thick and it was hard to make out who, at all, was in the structure. He aches to turn back the clock, to be given time to steer the bomb to an empty field. But he can't. In the structure, he definitely saw a small boy huddled in the corner, coated in dust, severely injured but still breathing. He knew the face. It was McDowell's own son, Landon. He lifted the boy to his chest, tightly for a hug, cupping his hand behind the child's little head, to hold it. The back of his skull was gone. The case I have retold, drawn from American journalist C.J. Chivas's The Fighters, is not one of collateral killing of non-combatants, but of accidental killing. Unlike some collateral killings that may be justified as necessary militarily or excused as part of eliminating a serious threat, accidents like these, all too numerous in war, are never justified as necessary or eliminative killings. There is no military good to be achieved. Killing the non-combatant is not part of a proportionality calculation. Still, the accidents may be legally or morally excusable due to poor intelligence, sudden blinding by enemy airfire, unpredictable shifts in flight patterns or cloud cover. This is the fog of war that McDowell faced. And yet innocents were horribly wronged. As the aviator who dropped the ordnance, McDowell carries the moral burden. In his accounting, he had a little over 10 seconds to readjust the targeting. Doubt crept in during those seconds. Why didn't he listen to the doubt? His punishment comes in the recurrent nightmare, in his wishing to turn back the clock and steer the bomb differently, in growing lukewarm over time about flight missions, in his yearning to know who was killed so he and the Navy can make atonement through compensation. This is a stunning example of military moral injury. In this case, a fighter can't exculpate himself, even if the doctrine of war can. We could say this is just the grandiosity of moral perfection at work, especially of warfighters who are raised on zero tolerance for screwing up, whether in keeping a rifle clean or in hitting a target with expensive precision munitions. Many hold themselves strictly liable, even when they ought not. I know from my decades of teaching military men and women that some can be rigid in their moral codes, sticking to a black and white sense of right and wrong in a world of war where there is too much grey. But shunting all almost military moral injury to psychological overreach misses the greater moral landscape. Even if we can't always count on sensitivities to accurately track what we morally should and shouldn't do, still, for those of us who aren't morally callous, the panoply of emotions experienced with moral injury, guilt, shame, moral indignation, resentment, betrayal, a yearning to atone, speak to our moral aspirations. Moral anxiety is inseparable from the desire to be good and to do better, even in the most cramped circumstances and in the face of horrible tragic luck. If those who go to war didn't feel anguish at the detritus of war, whether incurred by act or omission, suffered or witnessed, we'd wonder about their humanity. But can a modern military stoicism rooted in ancient teachings find room for moral injury? Can a stoic, bent on the calm that comes with discipline and virtue, leave space for the anxiety of perceived or real failure, or anger at those who make sport of war and take innocent civilians as their prey? Can civilians also learn how to forgive themselves for making mistakes or for accidents which have more to do with bad luck than with failures of moral responsibility? These aren't rhetorical questions. I pose them as an educator teaching civilians and military who serve and will serve, here and abroad. Some will serve not as public servants, but in private capacities, in their workplace and communities, and in their homes. The answer to these questions has ramifications for all. When we teach Stoic texts, are we reaping the right lessons? Can we construct a healthy modern Stoicism, grounded in ancient wisdom, that recognizes moral injury and the possibility for post-traumatic growth? Back to Stoic emotions and the moral progressor. The Stoics don't talk about moral injury, per se, but they do talk about moral distress. And they teach that such distress has no place in the personality profile of the ideal moral person. For with Socrates, they hold that the only real harm is to become unjust, and that is not a possibility for the truly virtuous person. A truly good person, teaches Socrates in the Apology, cannot be harmed in life or death. The Stoics fill out the paradoxical picture. Bad fortune, loss of loved ones, and physical or mental injury, even being wronged by others, don't affect our happiness or genuine well-being. We don't wish these things to happen, but all too often, they lie beyond our control. Our own moral wrongdoing, by contrast, is within our control. Or at least, the Stoics have us focus on pure cases where our hands aren't forced. They draw a bright line rule for a sage's behavior. A sage can do no wrong by definition. And so, there is no room for moral anguish or angst. But what if you are not a sage? After all, a sage rises only as often as the phoenix, about every 500 years. It's an ideal, and maybe one impossible to apply in our non-ideal, imperfect world. What if you are, like Seneca says he always is, just a moral progressor, aspiring to become better but subject to error, misevaluations of what is really worthy, caught in struggles with those in power who compromise moral autonomy and self-rule? For many of us, though maybe not all in our contemporary political scene, the compromises may not rise to the level of imperial court intrigue, with execution, poisoning, banishment, imprisonment, and enforced suicide looming in the background or foreground. But the basic condition of not being sin-free and yet aspiring to become better is, in part, what has appealed to readers of Seneca throughout the ages, in the Hellenistic world and the Judeo-Christian period that followed. And it also is part of the implicit appeal of Stoicism for the military. For their culture is one not just of unbridled can-doism, but of constraint and chains of authority that squeeze autonomy and force choices that leave moral detritus in their wake. Where do we find this thread of moral aspiration in Stoic writings? We first have to go back to Plato. For a famous teller of Stoic texts recalls this scene. The Tears of Alcibiades. At the conclusion of Plato's Symposium, a banquet in honor of the god Eros, Alcibiades, the morally flawed and disastrous military leader who betrayed Athens to the Spartans, bursts into the drinking party and addresses his love encomium directly to Socrates, his beloved moral tutor. Socrates, he confesses, is the only one who can really hold up a mirror to his errant ways and bring on the tears of shame. The anguish is, at times, excruciating, especially in Socrates' presence. For at those moments, says Alcibiades, he always traps me, you see, and he makes me admit that my political career is a waste of time, while all that matters is just what I most neglect, my personal shortcomings which cry out for the closest attention. Socrates is the only man in the world, he says, bearing his soul, who has made me feel shame. Ah, he says, knowing his audience, you didn't think I had it in me, did you? Yes, he makes me feel ashamed. Alcibiades is a tormented soul. He's not a typical weak-willed or acratic person, as Aristotle understood the term, someone who knows clearly what he should do but doesn't do it. Alcibiades doesn't have firm moral principles that get trumped on occasion, through temptation or self-deception or the like. He's far more ambivalent. He occasionally dips his toes into the waters of virtue, especially when Socrates is looking on and casting judgment. But, as he confesses, he hasn't really dedicated himself to the hard work of building new habits and weaning himself from old ones. Glory and fame still hold sway for him. He needs external prods and sanctions to keep him on course. In those moments, with Socrates in vivo or vividly in mind, he feels the deep shame of his old ways and of having too often caved into desires to please the crowd. And that is a spur to do better. The Tears of Alcibiades becomes a challenge for Stoic thought. How can we understand moral distress as a part of moral improvement? Cicero poses the challenge. Not himself a Stoic but a Roman redactor, an editor and preserver of the texts, often attracted to Stoic ways, Cicero insists in the Tusculan Disputations that Cleanthes, the second of the three Greek patriarchs of the Stoic school, doesn't take the problem seriously enough. It seems to me that Cleanthes does not take sufficiently into account the possibility that a person might be distressed over the very thing which Cleanthes himself counts as the worst of evils. And then Cicero reminds his readers of the Symposium passage, for we are told that Socrates once persuaded Alcibiades he was unworthy to be called human, and was no better than a manual laborer despite his noble birth. Alcibiades then became very upset, begging Socrates with tears to take away his shameful character and give him a virtuous one. Cicero presses the Stoics to make sense of Alcibiades' tears. What are we to say about this, Cleanthes? Surely you would not claim that the circumstances which occasioned Alcibiades' distress was not really a bad thing? Cicero hammers home the point later in the same essay. Suppose a person is upset about his own lack of virtue, his lack of courage, say, or of responsibility or integrity. The cause of his anxiety is indeed an evil. It is an impulse toward virtue itself, he says. Cicero admits that it can be an all too vigorous impulse that can lay us low. His therapeutic counsel is not to dismiss the cause of distress, but to control the outer expression. We should try to manage the tears and inconsolable depression. If the core cause and object of distress is our own wrongdoing, then we should seize the moment as an occasion for moral aspiration. It is a first step and impulse toward moral growth and repair. Let's return to our aviator case in Kosovo. Maybe there is some degree of culpability in this horrible accident. Whether or not there is, Lane McDowell holds himself responsible. So, too, do so many service members that I have interviewed and written about over the years, who come home from war when their battle buddies do not. They hold themselves morally responsible for being on leave the day when improvised explosive device, IED, blasts ripped through the army vehicle of a best friend, for having squatted rather than stood on the roof the second the insurgents took aim, for having given permission to a squad mate to get out of the Humvee to relieve himself in a spot that ended up being booby-trapped with mines. Survivor's guilt, accident guilt, holding yourself morally responsible for events in which you may not even be causally responsible is how service members carry the burden of care for each other. The guilt may be fitting of good character and care. You don't just feel grief, you feel you could have done something differently. Agency steps in to fill the horrible void. But all the same, the self-blame is too harsh and unfair. The right therapy in these cases involves redrawing the lines around agency and accountability. It's a case where letting go is understanding the limits of control. Self-compassion may have to come through others. That was a lesson Seneca urged in Hercules' Rages, as we saw in the previous lesson. It is a critical lesson for many who serve. Take checkpoint incidents in Iraq. A car with 2 military-aged men and a child fails to stop at the first round in a series of checkpoints close to a large, heavily populated U.S. military installation and arsenal. The car pushes through 2 additional checkpoints that come in quick succession without showing any signs of slowing down or heeding a sentry's warnings at each point. The man in the front passenger seat reaches for something under the seat as the car progresses through the checkpoints. As the passenger lifts his head and straightens his torso, he seems to be cradling an explosive device familiar from recent incidents. The sentry shoots just after the 3rd checkpoint, killing everyone in the car, and seconds before what, in fact, turns out to be a bomb detonates. As the army sentry considered his options, he was aware that his shots might kill the child, but also aware that in giving multiple warnings to the driver and in restraining fire until the 3rd checkpoint, he was taking considerable risk onto himself in order to minimize the risk to the child and maybe other innocents in the car while still securing the base. This is a hypothetical case, but not unlike those I have been told. Even if the child is being used as an involuntary shield, the soldier still feels horrific guilt at doing what he regards as unimaginable, killing an innocent child. And yet, according to the obligations of war, his action is unavoidable. His own self-sacrifice, as a way of avoiding the killing, would only lead to the death of many more soldiers on the base and abort the staffing and material for future missions. Again, the soldier's guilt seems fitting and yet harsh. This is the cruel reality of much moral injury in war. The reflexive reactive attitudes of shame, guilt, moral distress, and a sense of a shattered moral self that can come with killing, especially of young innocents caught in war zones, are attitudes we expect soldiers to feel. It is a way they hold themselves accountable in the face of conscientiously wielding lethal weapons. It is not just grief that they ought to feel for the loss of life in war. They rightly and fittingly view themselves as responsible agents. And for many, the line between just and unjust killing is thin and constantly shifting. But even so, the self-blame can be harsh, too punitive and unremitting. And one way of seeing that is by taking up an interpersonal perspective. A soldier likely wouldn't reproach another in a comparable checkpoint incident. He'd excuse him, or refrain from blame, appreciating what was an unavoidable and constrained action in the circumstances. And similarly, another might be a benevolent counselor to him, helping him see what he can't himself see or feel. Again, that's just the image Seneca depicts at the conclusion of Hercules' Rages, as Amphitryon refrains from blaming his son, Hercules, for the forced murders of his family and so, too, Hercules' close companion, use your heroic courage to not stay angry at yourself, begged Theseus. But we don't easily give ourselves the same pass that we urge on others or others urge on us. It seems right, in the checkpoint incident, for the soldier to see what he did as morally unthinkable. Indeed, we want soldiers to keep something of the conscience of their civilian souls in the very act of soldiering. But we also want to help them find ways to lessen and relieve fitting guilt, so the burden they bear is fairer. And again, this is where Seneca teaches that the point of view of others should enter. Even if we sometimes motivate morality by self-reproach, by shame and distress, we need others to correct our self-regarding attitudes when they are overwrought or far too punishing. The benevolence and goodwill of others, their forgiveness and at times mercy, are what's needed to nurture our own self-empathy so critical for resilience. Seneca's plea for mercy. The idea of having erred and finding a way forward as moral aspirant is nowhere more evident than in Seneca's essay on mercy, addressed to Nero. In writing it, Seneca says he holds up a mirror for Nero to better see his ways. But the mirror is one Seneca holds up to himself, as well. As public spokesperson for the court, Seneca is also expressing the hope of the greater public that the tyrant will somehow show restraint, especially in the wake of having just murdered his half-brother Britannicus, at age 14, to thwart his claim to the throne. The essay's shadow twin is Seneca's play, The Trojan Women. In the essay, we see the promise of mercy. In the play, we see the wasteland of an after-war world bereft of it. Mercy, in the essay, is cast as the humane virtue in a world of human frailty. It is not pardon, the remission of a deserved punishment, but leniency in exacting punishment. It is stopping short of what might have been deservedly imposed. It is a staying of the hand, restraint and calming of vengeful anger, an acknowledgement that most accusers are not themselves free of all blame. We have all sinned, some in serious, some in trivial things, some from deliberate intention, some by chance impulse, or because we were led away by the wickedness of others. Some of us have not stood strongly enough by good resolutions. Even if we become perfectly virtuous, we would have arrived there by some moral erring along the way. There is no sinless path in moral progress. Mercy makes good on the gentler side of Stoicism, lost on critics, protests Seneca, who see only Stoicism's sturdy austerity. The Stoic moral tutor, like the good farmer, or vintner, as Seneca was in his country estates, is ready to adjust soil in need of nutrients, prop up a tree growing crooked, or prune the branches of another so those dwarfed by its shadow are now open to the light. Moral tutelage, by analogy, is a matter of tender cultivation and willingness to show lenience, even if, by a stricter reading of rules and norms, harsh punishment might be rightfully imposed. Such is Andromach's plea to Ulysses in the concluding scenes of Seneca's Trojan Women. The Greeks, despite their victory, find themselves once again stuck without the right winds to set sail. And following a familiar script, Calchas, the Greek priest, recommends Hector and Andromach's young baby son, Astyanax, be sacrificed and, too, that Polyxena, the young daughter of Priam and Hecuba, be slaughtered as a war bride on Achilles' tomb by his proxy, his son Pyrrhus. The children must bear the crimes of their forefathers. The ghost of Achilles kills his young bride and a baby boy is thwarted from becoming a warrior who can reignite another cycle of the Trojan War. The future Trojan warrior boy must face his fate. But his mother, Andromache, is in a mortal battle with Ulysses to protect her innocent child. She has hidden him in her husband Hector's tomb, a place safe from enemy destruction. She begs Ulysses for mercy, for kindness, for herself as a hostage of war and as a mother whose child is her only comfort. The boy is no threat, she pleads, too young and without any power or backing to rearm a city. The boy may be a royal, but he is as good as a slave now, just put a yoke on his royal neck. To kill him is a crime of war, protests Andromache, and the atrocity will be pinned not on the gods but on you, Ulysses. But a Greek warrior, set on vengeance, cannot stay the impulse. Anger, as Seneca once again teaches, can't be stopped, once set in motion. I wish I could be merciful. I cannot, answers Ulysses. The transmission of war, across generations, will go on, in violation of war's permissions. Once the appetite for warrior anger is whet, it knows no bounds. Innocent children, killed by mistake or vengeance, are war's pawns. Ulysses, the wily warrior, cunning strategist, cannot find a strategy for showing mercy, once the warrior mode grabs hold. What we next see is the stunning consequence of the rage, a little boy forced to step off the steep embankment that was once the site of his grandfather Priam's watchtower. The boy's body shatters with the impact of the plunge. His corpse is mangled, his skull cracks open, brains spurt out, a little boy pulverized as if by a high-impact bomb. Pleas of leniency, entreaties to restrain a victor's revenge, reminders that these children are victims, not contributors to war, the impotency of a ghost warrior groom, all reminders that though the aggression of the war is over, none of this stays the hand of ruthless rage. This is a strange play, we might think, for a moralist of calm. Or maybe not, for it's a cautionary tale about excessive punishment and the difficulty of staying the impulse of raging revenge in war. But it is also about leniency in the face of overzealous punishment, whether directed at an external enemy or the enemy within. We hope Ulysses might hear the plea for mercy, for the sake of a mother and a child. But also, for the sake of himself and his troops. For maybe he will come to feel guilt, and his soldiers, too, for what they have done to an innocent. Maybe the guilt will rack them for years to come and be the next feared Trojan War, but this one an inner war, that is fought over and over and over. Mercy is, of course, far more elusive than anger. It requires discipline. First you have to vanquish anger. So there is space to heal. Guilt is self-anger. Self-mercy may be its therapy. A plea for self-mercy. Let's return to the naval aviator Lane McDowell. There were no formal investigations of the incident over Kosovo. It is not clear whether by following fuller procedures, McDowell could have averted the accident. What we know is that McDowell, above all else, is his own judge and revisits the scene in flashbacks. He probably also revisits the scenes in his mind as he checks for accuracy in Chivas's typed-up account of his quotes and then, later, his story, as Chivas narrates it, when he turns to reading the book. What McDowell pictures is strikingly like what Seneca pictures in Astyanax's demise: a young boy's body shattered, the back of his head missing, an innocent made all too vulnerable in war. What we hope for on behalf of this Navy pilot is some mitigation of the self-punishment, some leniency and self-empathy that allow for a way to move beyond the rage of distress without losing the moral meaning that comes from the anguish. What we hope for is self-mercy. We want him to be able to loosen the rage of his felt guilt by imagining if he would blame others as harshly as he blames himself. His feelings may be apt, but relentlessly harsh. As I have said, there is often asymmetry in how we hold self and others to account, especially, in the case of military moral injury. Self-blame may be far harsher than blame for those who cover your back. But that opens a path for healing. We need to show ourselves the compassion we would show others in similar circumstances, or show ourselves what we imagine that they show us. The benevolence of the benevolent spectator, at times, needs to become part of the moral self. There is a political lesson here, too. We who don't go to war need to start taking greater responsibility for the wars to which we send others to fight on our behalf. We need to carry the moral burden by doing a better job of knowing which causes of war are just and worth our nation's most precious resources. Seneca is a complex spokesperson for calm. What sometimes parades as conscience is the rumbling of the unconscious and its conflicts. He yearns for simplicity and tranquility at the same time. He is attracted to the messy world of high-stakes power and hierarchy. Modern-day warriors, and many in frontline and emergency relief work, also live in complicated moral worlds, committed to excellence but working in institutions that vastly limit their individual control, exposed to situations that constantly test their best judgment and capacity for steady restraint. Exposure to moral injury is no surprise in those environments. But the Senecan lesson I have been urging is that this very injury may open the way for moral growth and the calm of repair. To read Stoicism as forswearing the possibility of good moral distress is to miss Seneca's more profound lessons for modern resilience. Lesson 7. Lifehacks. From dye to textiles. Legend has it that Zeno from Citium was a dye merchant, shipwrecked with a cargo of purple dye on the Aegean Sea, when he safe-harbored in Athens. He wandered into a bookshop, stumbled upon Xenophon's account of Socrates, and immediately sought out teachers like him in the marketplace. It wasn't long before he gathered his own disciples there on a colonnaded porch with panel paintings, the Stoa Poikile, and developed a following that took its name from their meeting place, the Stoics. Fast forward some 2 millennia. Another merchant drifts away from the textile market, stumbles upon the writings of Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, and gathers disciples on a virtual porch through daily email blasts and a website that reaches hundreds of thousands of people. The Stoic marketer is Ryan Holiday, former director of marketing for American Apparel and author of many best-selling books for finding calm, but also a primer on public relations, growth hacker marketing. Through Holiday and others, the idea of Stoicism as a life hack has gone viral, with entrepreneurs and billionaires, personal trainers and coaches, programmers and educators all turning to Stoicism for life hacks for resetting values and quieting stress. But what exactly is a life hack? My husband, Marshall Presser, has been in the computer industry longer than most. As a tech author, he knew what a hack was, and a hacker, and hacking into a system, but not a life hack. And so, he pulled a signed book off his shelf, tucked in next to the many big data manuals, the New Hacker's Dictionary, a 1991 revised edition. We started there. Hack 1. N originally, a quick job that produces what's needed, but not well. In short, it's a way of jury-rigging something inelegant but effective for solving a problem. The next definition struck a more positive note. 2. N. An incredibly good, and perhaps very time-consuming, piece of work that produces exactly what is needed. But there was no life hack in 1991. The term seems to have been coined at a 2004 O'Reilly Emerging Technology Conference in San Diego by a technology journalist, Danny O'Brien, who used the term to describe the shortcuts productive IT professionals use to get their work done. By 2005 the term spread in the tech and blogging community and was runner-up by the American Dialect Society for Most Useful Word of the Year behind podcast. By 2011 Lifehack was added to the August Oxford Dictionaries online. A life hack is a shortcut for handling life's challenges. So, is Stoicism a life hack? Maybe, in the sense that the ancient Stoics offer strategies for managing the emotional stress and strain of life. The Roman Stoics simplify the practices for public consumption. It's no surprise that angel investor and bestseller author of the 4-Hour Workweek book and podcast, Tim Ferriss, turns to Stoicism for simple but powerful exercises for overcoming anxiety and paralysis. He has championed Holiday's book The Obstacle is the Way as a must-read for life hackers. In his 2017 TED Talk with over 7 million views, Ferriss recasts the Stoic technique of pre-rehearsing evils as a way of dealing with hard choices that involve, as he puts it, what we most fear doing, asking, saying. He dubs the technique fear-setting, and it's meant to replace the usual goal-setting of business plans and strategies. The method is concrete and the stuff of a Silicon Valley whiteboard brainstorming session. But it's aimed at self-health, not organizational health. He instructs viewers to divide a sheet of paper into 3 columns. In the first column, from 1 to 10, name and write down a list of fears in full detail, visualizing worst-case scenarios. In the second column next to each fear, write down what you can do to prevent the bad outcomes, again in full detail. In the third column, write down what damage repair would look like if you just can't prevent the bad outcomes. In a nutshell, know the enemy you might be fighting, do your best to prevent the worst, and if prevention doesn't work, focus on fixes. The Greek Stoics, as we said in Lesson 3, dub that proactive strategy as dwelling in advance. Vividly imagine future evils, as if now present. They formulate a life hack prototype, stamp out an image, as it were, within yourself of what is going to happen, and habituate yourself to it little by little as to something that has already happened. If prevention doesn't work, move on to treatment, learn to separate and accept what you can control from what you can't. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with that dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us and some are not up to us. If is one of those things that is not up to us, be ready to say, you are nothing in relation to me. In Ferriss's case, the preoccupying fear was the downside of taking a break from his manic work schedule to go to London for a month to unwind and extricate himself from a bottleneck in the business. His top fear, as he began to break it down, was that if he went to London, he'd just get depressed in the rainy, cold weather, and so the plan of going there for a positive, healthy retreat would be pointless. His second fear was that he would miss a letter from the IRS and so get audited or raided. He'd have more business worries than when he left. In the prevent column, next to the first fear about the gloomy weather, he jotted down that he could take a portable blue light lamp with him and use for it for 15 minutes every morning to stave off a depressive episode. The second fear was easily managed by a forwarding address so the IRS could send paperwork directly to his accountant. But then there was the third column, repair. What if the worst-case scenarios unfolded? What would he do? Ferriss is not short on cash. If he gets depressed in London, then he can always fly to Spain for some bright sun. That's what the Brits do. And in the case of the IRS letter getting lost, he could hire a good lawyer who has experience in this kind of case and could repair the damage. Ferriss's net worth is estimated, by some, at $100 million. His problems are of the mighty and the elite. Some problems, many of us would snicker. They're problems of his making, from his massive success, that he's now profiting from. His target audience are mid-level white-collar workers stuck in cubicles for countless hours in deeply unsatisfying jobs. They don't have his money or means. Still, Ferris's interest in Stoicism may not just be entrepreneurial. In his 2017 TED Talk, he shares that he suffers from bipolar depression, and that he was suicidal in his senior year at Princeton. Managing the symptoms seems to be in the background when he mentions several times in the talk turning off the high-speed chatter of his monkermind, or dealing with the threat of depressive episodes. His emotional highs and lows may be more extreme than those many of us experience. But he is convincing, in part, because he knows emotions and their turbulence. He knows the cost of not managing frustration and threat, and the paralysis that can set in if they are left unattended. The teachable lesson is not that Stoicism is an empirically based treatment for bipolar disorder. If Ferris misleads in that way, then he's a dangerous salesman and a quack. But I don't think he's naive about psychiatric illness and its serious medical treatment. The more charitable read is that he has found Stoicism a useful philosophy of empowerment. And he knows how to sell it. Lifehacks, who's good? Ancient Stoicism appeals to many precisely because of its promise of self-mastery and inner freedom. Epictetus's writings and life are emblematic of the point. He was an enslaved person under Epictetus, an administrator in the court of Nero. If there is freedom, Epictetus taught, it has to be inner. Tyrannical emperors, banishment, and forced suicides turn people inward. Roman imperial history is filled with accusations of conspiracy and the cost of opposing power. These are lessons now to heed. But inner retreat then, and inner retreat now, can be ways of avoiding threat and not just managing it. Life hacks can be selfish in that they disregard the external problems in the world that need fixing. They become about me, so that selfless courage disappears. This can't be the full promise of ancient virtue. From Socrates onward, virtue was never just about me and my temperance, but about others and my generous and just treatment of them. Plato's just soul required the mirror of a just city. Aristotle frames ethics within the larger context of social and political discourse. Courage, he insists, has to do with standing one's ground against fears for the sake of what is fine. And what is most fine, he says, is not just the goodness of a person, but the collective good. Though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one person, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for a polis, a city-state. The Stoics expand the polis to the cosmos. They have an early vision of a global community and the affiliations and obligations that bind it. The ideal of moral goodness, then and now, is about how we share our humanity and the promise of common reason. Virtue can't just be about finding tranquility through retreat. All this has profound application now as our nation wakes up from its own retreat of sorts from the legacy of enslavement. A pandemic and the brutal killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police have been catalysts for social unrest. The two are linked in that a new virus has laid bare how it disproportionately kills those who have for decades suffered from an old virus of racism. Philip Ozua, chief executive of Montefiore Health System in the Bronx, New York, knows those links and his own battle with each. In a moving opinion piece, he writes that in March, April, and May of 2020 the coronavirus killed over 2,000 patients in his hospital center and over 20 members of the staff, despite best efforts to save them. No sooner did the pandemic caseload drop than he had to come to grips with another fearful crisis, the lethal effects of racism, the pain of which, as a black man, he writes, is all too familiar to me. And so, he watched with anguish the video of Amy Cooper, a white woman, calling 911 in Central Park telling the dispatcher 3 times, "An African American is threatening my life," a false accusation. The black male, with binoculars slung around his neck, was Christian Cooper, unrelated to Amy Cooper, and an avid 57-year-old birder who politely was asking Cooper to leash her dog, as required by park rules. That was the provocation. The incident occurred just a few hours before George Floyd was killed. Ozua knew how the park incident could be marshaled to advantage. And what could come next? In his own case, too familiar to those of color, how you could be walking in a white neighborhood, running for a bus, and the police could ask you to put your arms up, turn around, walk backward, get on your knees, interlace fingers behind your head, and get frisked, before any questions were asked. Cory Booker, the longest tenured current black senator in the Senate, lives with similar fears. I'm still very conscious when I'm not dressed like a senator, and even when I am, that I still could be one misunderstanding away from a very bad incident. He feels near shame, he says, and profound regret, that 30 years after Rodney King's killing by Los Angeles police, he has to have the same conversations with his young mentees about learning to fear police for their own safety that adults had with him in his teenage years. He has to teach them the same coping mechanisms. Epictetus insists that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. But coping mechanisms can't be a permanent or viable fix for oppression. If modern Stoicism aims to dismantle disabling fear, then it has to address fears at many levels, like those of Ozua and Booker, that are responses to collective fears about threatened loss of status and power, and those of cultures, embraced by white and black police officers alike, that support a troubling and vicious warrior model of lethality. Modern Stoic self-mastery can play a role in reform. As a life hack, Stoicism offers proactive techniques for taking stock of near-blind habits and impulsive reactions. These include how we see and the near-automatic emotional arousals triggered by what we see. Implicit and explicit bias fuels perceptions of threat and impulsive responses to it. The Stoics famously teach that we can learn to put space between our impressions, even the impulsive impressions, hormeticae phantasiae, and our assent to them, especially when those impressions distort or are part of a tapestry of wrong-headed values. Racial profiling and all forms of implicit bias are ways of assenting to impressions without inserting space between the impression and the assent. Facial recognition systems are a high-tech form of racial profiling. They rely on mugshots and criminal databases that are seldom scrubbed of innocent people. Some tests struggle to distinguish among darker-skinned faces. They are a virtual way of assenting to impressions that easily distort. On anger, Seneca argues that habituation and constant attention may lessen near-automatic responses. He is well aware that automaticity can be life-saving. We are wired for fast-track emotions, for quick responses to life threat, for a good reason. They are fortuitous mental impulses, Seneca writes with near clairvoyance. Thus is that even the bravest man often turns pale as he puts on his armor, that the knees of even the fiercest soldier tremble a little as the signal is given for battle. These are what we now know as the flight or fight responses of the autonomic nervous system that allow fast response to perceived dangers. Seneca writes that those involuntary movements may need to be monitored and consciously attended so there is space for more deliberate decision. Seneca is a precursor to psychologist and decision theorist Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman posits that we have two systems in the brain, one that operates automatically with little or no voluntary control, and a second that is more effortful and associated with choice and greater analysis. We navigate life thinking fast and slow, as he famously puts it. We need to mobilize attention when cognitive errors and biases, products of thinking fast, put us at risk of being manipulated by irrational fears. Honorable police and service members fight on the front lines of violence. They have to react fast under threat. But those same quick responses are sometimes defensive bulwarks against just conduct, whether in the battle space of war or on the streets of a city. In the use of lethal weapons, they can be ways of assenting to impressions too impulsively, without the courage of restraint. Marathon or sprint. In another day and age, at the beginning of the last century, Freud viewed avoiding fears, including not talking about them, as a form of denial. Denial is a pervasive feature of defense mechanisms that keep at bay disturbing events, feelings, or thoughts. We engage in all sorts of defenses, like projecting our insecurities onto others in order to protect ourselves from inner conflict, or magical thinking, where we deny reality so we can miraculously triumph over what might be too unpleasant to face. The tropes are well worn. We may succeed in warding off some anxieties, only to have them talk through our bodies in the form of symptoms we'd prefer to chalk up to purely physical ailments. Freudian-inspired psychoanalytic psychotherapy is a marathon, not a sprint. It's not a hacker's shortcut. It's an investment in process, and time and money, that could take you back to early childhood and parents, but also to the dynamics now in this room with this therapist as a screen for seeing how you are perceived and how you see yourself perceived. You watch yourself in a safe clinical space without all the tension of family dynamics. You develop an observing ego. The prototype is Socratic, know thyself. And it requires talking. It's the talking cure, as Anna O., or Bertha Pappenheim, the famous patient of Freud, dubbed it early on in Vienna. Life hacking through modern Stoic coaching is a different model. It's a behavioral therapy of sorts in that its primary focus is not discourse, but action and concrete steps to change entrenched habits. Still, it starts with talk, name your fears, jot down meditations, as Marcus did at night on the battlefield. It's an early form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Stoic coaching aims to accelerate change in a way unimaginable in the multi-year, 4 times a week, 50-minute-hour plan of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Still, modern Stoic counsel shares with traditional psychotherapy the goal of self-exploration. Ferris's turn to Stoicism, like that of many who are attracted to it, comes at a critical juncture in a personal journey. Many are after personal growth or self-transformation in the wake of a painful breakup or work-life crisis. They want to find meaning after being in a place that's no longer fulfilling. Divorce shocks you, said Jeff Loesch, a 57-year-old senior technology consultant and infrastructure architect who went through a painful divorce, after 19 years of marriage, 4 years before he lost his job of 17 years when his company was acquired in a corporate takeover. A business networking event led him to a life coach, and then his own life coach training and certification. A few years later, he stumbled on ancient and modern Stoic thought through Holiday's The Daily Stoic Meditations, and moved on to other online Stoic sites and podcasts, like Simon Drew's The Practical Stoic, where I met him when I was interviewed as a special guest and he was a listener. Simon Drew himself turned to hosting the podcast almost full-time after he quit his job running a gym on the Sunshine Coast of Australia. It was Ferris's podcasts that originally gave him an interest in Stoicism and led him to his current path. Never much of a reader, now, in his late 20s, he has read many of the major Roman Stoic texts, and has even dabbled in Diogenes Laertius's colourful, and at times, gossip column-like biographies of ancient lives. His home studio is stacked high with ancient texts as backdrop behind his retro-vintage radio mic. Some who follow Drew's podcasts are drawn to his style of coaching through explicit Stoic texts. Drew was raised religiously as a Mormon, and he is at home with the idea of turning to the teachings of a text and quoting them by heart. He brings on his podcast scholars as well as practitioners. What appeals to many of the followers is the overall notion of ancient Stoicism as offering highly practical and yet time-worn insight into finding calm through virtue. But stress is not always to do with me or what I can fix through self-quest. Stress comes from relationships and the implicit and explicit valence in our interactions. It comes from living in functional and dysfunctional families. In the business world, it comes from poorly run organizations and processes, from promising too much to clients with tools that are outmoded or not enough headcount to carry out the work. For some in the military, it comes from deepening conflicts of conscience and career. In a nation divided by color and class and technology, it comes from systemic injustice and economic inequities. Stress is caused by lack of physical security, health security, food security, and more. Stress is caused by fear of police and by entrenched municipal systems of police force unresponsive to reform from within or without. Mental stress is not just about threats of my own making. If Stoicism is to offer credible lessons for modern resilience, then it can't teach that we leave the line of what is within our control where we find it. We often have to move the line, so that the way things are, is not the way things must be. But moving the lines is not easy, and it can lead to painful discussions about protection and risk, as in this conversation aired on NPR between a son and mother, days after the killing of George Floyd. Sean Richardson is 17 and a runner. For Sean, running track feels like freedom. Winning. Running. Everything. I mean, I love everything about it. But with school closed due to COVID-19, track has been cancelled. And running now means doing it solo in the streets of Minneapolis without the protection of his white friends that he just took for granted. He wasn't really that different from them, a runner who loves running. But Sean now can't hide from the dangers. Nor can his mother, Minnesota State Representative Ruth Richardson. They live 15 miles from where George Floyd was killed. Sean tries to cope. He tries to reassure his mother, if I can't run in the neighborhood, I can run on a track or something, you know? It's not the end of the world. But his mother sees it differently. It is the end of the world. Because if you can't run in our neighborhood, If you can't walk out into the world and just be seen as a 17-year-old boy who loves to run, there's something deeply wrong with that. This is a conversation about freedom. It is not one that Epictetus would be having with his young disciples. But it is one that we as teachers are having with our students. I've had my own hard conversations about freedom with a first-year student at Georgetown who only 6 months earlier learned that he was a descendant of one of 272 enslaved persons who were sold by Georgetown's Jesuits in 1838 to keep the university afloat. It changed how he saw his life, how he now came to understand why he was raised Catholic. His freedom felt new. And he felt vulnerable. He came to see me a lot in office hours. He just wanted to talk about how to study, about how much coffee to drink to stay awake and focused, about how much he liked certain readings, about how to balance a job and a heavy course load. We read Ta-Nehisi Coates in class. We watched parts of the documentary I Am Not Your Negro, based on James Baldwin's unfinished autobiographical manuscript. But he never talked about his own past in class. He kept his newly discovered family history close to him. He was still figuring it out. And I respected that. That semester, in a class of about 25, I had 4 students of color, 3 African Americans, and 1 American student raised and schooled in Southeast Asia. That student of color wrote about his own sense of being excluded from a dominant narrative of race and struggle for freedom. Ta-Nehisi Coates's story and James Baldwin's were not his. His oppression was different. He was a remarkable student, but lonely in America. For moderns, like my students, psychological freedom can't be pried apart from freedom afforded through dignity and respect and a sense of inclusion. The idea is ancient, however absent in history and practice. Cicero lays the foundation of dignitary respect, grounded in our shared common reason. Thus we must exercise respectfulness towards humans, towards the best of them and also towards the rest. The duty which is derived from this leads to agreeing with and preserving nature. It is suited to bonding humans together. It falls on modern Stoic coaches and disciples to do their part in constructing a society founded on that promise of respect and dignity for all. The global connection. Jack Dorsey, co-founder of Square and Twitter, is another Silicon Valley entrepreneur drawn to Stoicism. What especially appeals to him is the idea of building toughness through deprivation. In Dorsey's case, unlike that of a young military recruit or POW, he gets to pick and choose his deprivations. He opts for ice baths at 5 a.m., walking 5 miles each way to and from work without a coat even when it's cold, and eating a single meal a day. There are shades of Diogenes the Cynic here, and Socrates, Stoic inspirational icons, both of whom famously did away with outer garments, ate little, and gave the air of being impervious to the cold. In Dorsey's remake of the ancients, you do uncomfortable things to build neuropathways that make you more resilient. Nothing has given me more mental confidence than being able to go straight from room temperature into the cold. To which one reporter quipped, "Try Toronto in the winter, sir." But there is a more substantive recasting of a Stoic theme. And that has to do with global connection. Twitter's mission is about instant dissemination of information in ways that improve and do not detract from a free and global conversation. There is no shortage of good reasons to be extremely cynical about how shrinking discourse to 140 or even 280 characters can improve global conversation. Lax self-policing on Twitter and other social media platforms contributes to misinformation and incendiary bombast. Over the years, the platforms have widened the so-called Overton window, a term named after Joseph Overton for the range of political ideas the public is willing to accept. Discourse once deemed unsafe or too fringe is now more mainstream. Within that expanded range, social bots and trolls spread half-truths, hyperglobalized discourse mixes within siloed spaces. Megaphones create noise in ways that readers of traditional media often find uncomfortable and dangerous. Twitter and other social media kickstarted the Arab Spring but also gave birth to a battlefield that helped to tear apart the movement. Twitter is a tool, and like any tool, as the ancients taught, it can be used for good or ill. Still, if visualizing fears and bads in vivid detail is a Stoic technique for confronting what's unsettling, then Twitter, these days, has functioned as a life hack for a collective reckoning with racism. The current changed conversation about race owes much to the graphic viral video of Floyd's murder by police, with Officer Chauvin's knee pressed to Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. 3 days after Floyd's murder, nearly 8.8 million tweets contained the #BlackLivesMatter hashtag. Similarly, the racial confrontation in Central Park was captured on camera by Christian Cooper, whose sister later posted the clip to Twitter. It has been viewed more than 40 million times. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook all give us ways of seeing bads more directly, many of which we may not anticipate ourselves suffering, but that we may be complicit in helping to create. If we are undisturbed by these images, then freedom from emotional distress may come too easily. There is a final point about Dorsey's commitments and their intersection with Stoic themes. Dorsey has emerged as one of the most generous billionaires, donating about 1/3 of his assets to a combination of coronavirus relief efforts, universal basic income, and support for girls' health and education. When asked why he gives, again he cites global connection. "I live by the principle of everything is connected, so if someone is in pain, I'm in pain, ultimately over time." Whatever other factors go into his gifting, Dorsey has spurned the usual Silicon Valley mantra of earn now, figure out the giving later. He is also transparent about his giving, disclosing each gift in real time on a public Google spreadsheet. Giving quickly and publicly may be a way of avoiding all the asks of those chasing your money. But it also is a way of leading by example. Seneca in On Favus, De Beneficiis, has much to say about the subtle nuances of wise benefaction, when to give openly, and when to give in secret. There are gifts, he says, that contribute nothing to preferment or prestige, but simply help against infirmity, poverty, or degradation. He rails against gifts that are simply for the public record or by benefactors who make you feel frayed and crushed by continual reminders of service rendered. Pointless gifts, like giving books to a country bumpkin or hunting nets to a scholar or man of letters or winter clothes at midsummer, undermine the purpose of giving. So, too, do gifts given out of greed for gratitude or approbation. Tweeting your gifts in real time is certainly a kind of applause drawing. But it is also a nudge to others to stop sitting on their fortunes. Gift giving in ancient times was viewed as central to social cohesion. It, more than anything else, holds society together, says Seneca. This is of a piece with the more basic Stoic point that our natures are social and that our self-sufficiency is relational. We rely on each other for goodwill, concretely, in material and emotional convences. Cicero anticipates the point with a rhetorical question. Scan the contents of your mind. Would you prefer an Epicurean life of the calm of continual pleasure, or a life where you endure pain but do good for all of humanity? Beneficence and gratitude are the weave of social fabric. Modern philosophers, most famously Peter Strawson, recast the point. The expression of goodwill and gratitude are ways we hold each other to account as members of a shared community. Benefits don't themselves express goodwill. We look for the manifestation of attitude itself in those benefits. Philanthropy is no replacement for social justice, however wide we take the community. Twitter's aim is to widen the boundaries, at least of conversation. It, along with other social platforms, needs to be more aggressive in monitoring that conversation against dangerous falsehoods and lies. But the core idea of logos or conversation connecting a world is a modern twist on an ancient Cynic and Stoic idea. A life hack for beating death. Silicon Valley has played with another life hack that is stranger to square with Stoicism. And that is beating death. The Stoics famously meditate on facing death through rehearsal of the fact of our mortality. Their mantras are not about defying death but facing it with equanimity. That is the point of their urging repeated practice of memento mori, keeping death in mind. Of all the fears, this is one we especially need to conquer. The person who fears death will never do anything worthy of one who is alive, as Seneca says. In the letters, Seneca faces his own age and declining health. He has difficulty breathing. He has suffered from asthma since his childhood. And now there are more gasping fits. It feels like suffocation. The doctors say it's a physical rehearsing for death. He's been preparing for it philosophically all his life. That again is an idea portrayed by Socrates. Philosophy is practice for dying and death, Socrates famously says in Plato's Phaedo. Seneca casts the philosophical training this way. Wouldn't you say a person was quite stupid if he thought that a lamp was worse off after it was extinguished than before it was lighted? We too are extinguished, we too are lighted. Between times is something that we feel, on either side is complete lack of concern. This is an argument for symmetry on either side of life made familiar in the 1st century BCE by the Epicurean writer Lucretius. In practical terms, says Seneca, facing death means seizing the day now. Present time is very brief. It is easy for the engrossed to get distracted. Do you want to know how they do not live long? Old men beg in their prayers for the addition of a few more years. They pretend they are younger than they are. But the wise person will not hesitate to go to meet death with steady step. If death, on the Stoic view, is to be accepted as an indifferent, even if a dispreferred one, then how do the lifehackers justify enlisting the Stoics as allies? This is a place where some moderns see the Stoics as giving a nod to push out the boundaries of control. Here, fear is not the obstacle, but lack of time. And it is just the sort of thing the love of the hack might fix. Take biohacker Jeffrey Wu, an influential figure in San Francisco, whose company, HVMN, Health via Modern Nutrition, is a human enhancement company, making nootropics, compounds for improving memory, cognition, stamina, and more. His tech company also instituted an intermittent weekly fast day for staff. When pushed, in a Vox interview, about the end goal of biohacking, he embraced immortality. "Yeah. I'd like to live forever." "Why?" pressed the interviewer. "Why not? It's a very cultural notion that we're expected to perish. I don't think it's techno-optimism. I think it's human desire. Aristotle might urge some sanity here. We need to distinguish mere wish," he says, "from desires connected with choice and action. Choice cannot relate to impossibles," he insists, even though there may be a wish even for impossibles, such as for immortality. Wish, Aristotle continues, may relate to things that in no way can be brought about by one's own efforts. But that's precisely the biohacker's challenge, to redefine what's possible, including human immortality. Wu may not himself be an avowed Stoic devotee, but many of his followers are, especially the fasting billionaires who want high performance and years added on by controlling caloric intake. There may be growing science here about diet and fasting. But the modeling of this on Stoic control oversteps the Stoic vision of self-mastery. Stoic athletic discipline of mind and body includes wise selection of the externals that affect our life chances. We are taught to select in ways that accord with nature, however inscrutable nature's laws. But one thing that bounds our human nature, even if we share reason with the gods, is that we, unlike them, are finite mortals. Any idea that wise and prudent living can eliminate death is decidedly un-Stoic. Still, we might think that the Stoics open themselves to just this kind of misappropriation. After all, their techniques are about protecting against vulnerability. Yes, but, as we have seen, they frame protection in terms of adaptability, not bulletproof invincibility. So, Seneca reminds us, we ought also to make ourselves adaptable, faciles, lest we become too fond of the plans we have formed. The danger is rigidity about end goals, including what some Stoic biohackers fashion themselves as doing, becoming bulletproof against death. Indeed, it's hard to avoid seeing the aspiration to immortality as something other than glory chasing or hubris. Even if the hack to beat death is driven by an engineer's curiosity and tech-based faith that the sky is the limit, there is still the wish to be around long enough to see the fruits of one's technical innovations. And that, again, is more about ego and success than virtuous striving. There is a final Stoic lesson about biohacking to beat death. The Stoics famously faced death in ways that were both visceral and dramatic. Chosen and forced suicides were a part of Roman life. Rubens's famous portrait of Seneca, with bulging veins, suggests that facing death by suicide was neither solitary nor necessarily serene. As with Socrates' death in the Phaedo, which Seneca reenacted, friends were present, there was conversation, and in Seneca's case, the trust that his last words would be remembered. But there was also in the Stoic canon the idea that again derives from Socrates, that there can be a rational departure from life, a way of reading reason in nature that justifies suicide. For the Stoics, suicide belongs to a special class of what is fitting or appropriate actions, ta kath konta. The proper reasons for rational departure are detailed and lengthy, especially given that our normal duty is to preserve life and our natural constitution. Diogenes Laertius tells us, the The wise person will make a rational exit from life, either on behalf of his country or for the sake of his friends, or if he suffers intolerable pain or mutilation or incurable disease. Those last conditions are the negative external goods, the so-called dispreferred indifference. And since life itself only has real value as the material means for virtuous action, if we can't act virtuously because lack of material means precludes meaningful choices, then suicide might be justified. Immanuel Kant offers a case with Stoic overtones. He tells of a person bitten by a mad dog. The man believes with good reason that he now suffers from an incurable disease, hydrophobia, a symptom of rabies in humans, that will leave him demented. In a suicide note, as Kant relates the case, the man said he killed himself lest he harm others as well in his madness. The example is telling. For although Kant, in general, holds that suicide is contrary to duty, here he argues that bodily disease can rob you of the means to act morally. And when it does, suicide may be justified. That is Stoic. What's germane for us in all this is that the Stoics were acutely aware that life could be cut short by illness or autocratic decree. Their philosophy of viewing life as the material condition for virtuous action offered them a way to justify rational exit. They never viewed the body as itself a material to be made resilient against all affronts. That's a modern notion of control it would hard for a Stoic to think was Stoic. Stoicism and toxic masculinity. Another appropriation of ancient Stoicism and, more generally, the classics is by hypermasculinists who spread their views on digital sites like Reddit, which hosts the misogynist Red Pill community. This is one of a number of alt-right misogynist platforms, sometimes referred to as the manosphere. The appropriation has been well researched recently by Donna Zuckerberg. For some, the appeal can be summed up in the monumental statue of Marcus Aurelius, a dead white warrior emperor, astride a horse, personifying notions of manly courage and vigor. Zuckerberg rightly laments that many who celebrate the rise of Stoicism as a self-help philosophy neglect to engage with the popularity of Stoicism in anti-feminist internet communities. Hateful ideologies have long appealed to the ancients for intellectual legitimacy. As classicist Curtis Dozier points out, the white supremacist website Stormfront.org features images of the Parthenon as a backdrop to its slogan "Every month is White History Month." The implicit argument, says Dozier, is that since white people built these structures, the white race is superior to other races. His own website Pharos, pages.vassar.edu/Pharos, documents many similar ways the classical past has been appropriated in support of oppressive politics against race and gender. The misogynist appropriation of Stoicism is especially suspect since the Stoics held that virtue has no gender. As Zeno understood it, an ideal moral community of sages included women in that utopian society. Since the Stoics also held that there are no degrees of perfect wisdom, you either are or are not a sage, women and men are equally sages and equal models for the ideal of full virtue. Moreover, if reason, for the Stoics, is a common feature of all humans, then that also has implications for the education of girls and boys. For even if there are gender differences, so long as reason is shared and at the core of human good, then the cultivation of human good through educating reason ought to be open to all. Musonius Rufus appeals to this in his advocacy of teaching women as well as men. It is worth quoting the passage in full. When someone asked him whether women too should do philosophy, this is how he began to argue that they should. He said, "Women have received from the gods the same rational faculty, logon, as men, the faculty that we use to communicate with one another and to reason about each thing, whether it is a good thing or not, and whether it is noble or shameful. Similarly, the female has the same faculties of sense perception as the male, sight, hearing, smelling, and the rest. Furthermore, a desire for ethical excellence and a natural orientation toward it belong not only to men, but also to women. For women, no less than men are pleased by noble and just actions, and reject the opposite. In short, in the best sort of moral world, women are moral models no less than men. They may not be astride a horse as a monument of Stoicism and Roman rule, but by desire and natural orientation, they are fully at home in the world of reason. Education ought to reflect that, argues Musonius. More can be said here. The feminist picture is incomplete by modern standards. But the key point is that feminism has a place in the ancient world, whether in Plato's Republic, Book 5, in the radical proposal that women are to be included in the guardian class of the just city, or in the Stoic reconstruction of that ideal society and its education program. The broader lesson in this chapter is that invocation of the Stoics takes many forms. Some of the texts can be abstruse and filled with newly minted philosophical terms. Others are deceptively simple. The Stoics give us their own shortcuts. Finding effective shortcuts is, of course, the point of hacking. The Stoics are tech allies because they often give their own hacks, or at least prototypes of them. They offer pithy quotes that can populate the internet and form the stuff of self-help. Stoicism fits the needs of modern hackers in a way that Aristotelian or Platonic philosophy just doesn't. But Stoicism is not just about self-help or self-enhancement. It is about moral progress and envisioning ways of enlarging the bonds of community through affiliation and obligation. Let us cultivate humanity, Seneca says at the conclusion of On Anger. One way he argues we can do it is by managing emotions and impulsive impressions that distort. Sometimes we need to learn to pause before we react. In the midst of a groundbreaking national conversation about Black Lives Matter, that is a powerful Stoic life hack. Say their names. Tim Ferriss's fear-setting hack instructs us to face fears concretely. Say the fears. Write them down. Visualize them. That modern Stoic notion of rehearsing fears resonates with me now. Say their names: George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evans, Malcolm X, Emmett Till. The list goes on. For those of us living with white privilege, saying their names is not just memorialization, but fear-setting. It is facing our vulnerability and what we take, and sometimes choose to take, as threats. The Stoics would have us stress the choose to take. What they teach is that we have more control than we tend to think in changing habits of perception and emotion. Even when arousals are near automatic, we may still need to control what comes next, including assessing whether threats are real, and whether we abuse our power or authority in our reactions. That is a kind of facing fears. It is a kind of courage. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon for more amazing audiobooks. Lesson 8. The Art of Stoic Living. Meditation, West meets East. Following a Pythagorean custom, Seneca tells us his bedtime meditation is to interrogate himself. He combs every crevice for faults and vices, concealing nothing from himself. He is his own secret examiner, reporting on his character. As a soporific, the nightly exercise may strike modern meditators as odd. If the Stoics teach that wisdom is the path to serenity, and meditating on virtue and vice is at the heart of that wisdom, then how is working full tilt on your character late at night a way to find calm? As a bedtime ritual, will it put you to sleep or keep you awake with brooding? Carl Rayner had a quick answer when Steve Martin called him late one night to discuss the next day's film shooting. Martin asked, "Am I interrupting you?" Rayner said, "No, I'm just lying here going through a litany of my failures." The Stoics weren't comedic self-deprecators. They might be more fun to read, if they were. But they were self-deprecators. Bring an accusation against yourself, as stringently as you can, instructs Seneca in the letters to Lucilius. Then conduct the investigation. Take the role of the accuser first, then the judge, and let that of the advocate come last. Be harsh with yourself at times. The Greek Stoics had a special term for this introspective examination of the mind, prosoc. It's a way of focusing attention and training vigilance. Epictetus, with usual hyperbole, urges that there is no part of your life to which attention does not extend. Just a little bit of laxity can lead to a more serious habit of not paying attention. And before long, you're on the path to moral lassitude. Is it possible to be altogether faultless? No, that it is impracticable. But we shall have cause to be satisfied if, by never relaxing attention, we shall escape at least a few faults. Contrary to current psychological findings, effort and cognitive focus, on the Stoic view, aren't resources that get depleted. Mental energy is renewable, and concern about how one's doing doesn't weaken self-control or performance by distraction with anxious thoughts. Mental effort only strengthens it. Marcus follows Epictetus's urging with his own nighttime meditations during the Germanic campaigns. Written to himself and imploring honest moral self-scrutiny, they would become the famed meditations. Seneca urges a similar heightened vigilance in his nighttime summoning of the mind to give account of itself. When the light has been taken away and my wife has fallen silent, aware as she is of my habit, reports Seneca, I scan the day and retrace all my deeds and words. The day has the usual irritants. With minor adjustments, the irritants could easily be hours. Seneca gives us a sample of his bedtime self-interrogation. 1. You were a bit too direct in what you said to your friend or family member. You were franker than you should have been in admonishing him. You did not help him, you just annoyed him. 2. You were at a dinner party. The conversation loosened with drink. You overheard a joke at your expense which struck home. It aimed to sting you and it did. Remind yourself that next time you'll be more careful about the company you keep. We might think Seneca would remind himself to be less sensitive to slights rather to pledge to avoid certain people. But here is an example of Stoic behavioral and not just cognitive modification. We should try to withhold assent to initial impressions and arousals that may disturb. But we should also try to avoid situations that arouse those responses. 3. You saw a friend lose her temper when she was refused entrance by a doorman at the home of a prominent lawyer or citizen. You yourself, on her behalf, lost your temper. Seneca reproves himself. Instead, stand back and laugh. Roll with the punches, I can hear my own father saying to his earnest daughter. 4. You were at a banquet and your host seated you at a table in the rear of the room far from the guest of honor and other persons of note. You're angry with the host, and envious of the guest who's seated where you think you should be. You chide yourself now, you lunatic, Seneca scoffs. What difference does it make where you're seated? Does your honor or shame, he chides, really depend on where you sit your bottom? 5. Someone has criticized your work and your talent. Is this to be a rule? If so, says Seneca, then those you've criticized, the great orators who preceded you, Hortensius, Cicero, and others, would be your enemy for mocking their speech writing. Thicken your skin, Seneca tells himself in so many words. Imagine if you were running for office, you really must put up with the way people vote. 6. And then there are the insults from cocky students or factious litigators. Remember what happened to Diogenes, the Stoic philosopher from Babylon. At the very moment he was lecturing on anger, a cheeky student spat on him. He bore it gently and wisely. No, said Diogenes, I am not angry. But I am not sure that I should not be. And Cato, says Seneca, had an even wittier repartee when he was pleading a case and one Lentulus, apparently angered by the proceedings, worked up a hefty mass of spittle that landed right on Cato's forehead. Cato kept his calm and tossed back his own salvo. I will swear to anyone, Lentulus, that people are wrong to say that you cannot use your mouth. The one-upmanship here doesn't seem to offend Seneca as a not-too-nice downgrade to upgrade your own standing. A sly, intellectual put-down is okay if it keeps a lid on angrier behavior. It deflects a critic and now gives Seneca, ever the rhetorician, an anecdote to entertain his own audience. Meditations, private or shared, and entertaining or not, are meant to bring calm to the meditator. Think of the sleep that follows the self-examination. How calm, deep and unimpeded it must be, Seneca assures us. Nighttime meditations followed by premeditations the next morning prepare you for the traps that may lay ahead. Again, following a Pythagorean teacher, Seneca says he learned to practice another exercise. When he started to get angry, he would look at his distorted face in a mirror. What oozed out was only a tiny fraction of anger's true ugliness. What if it were revealed naked? That's what meditative exercises try to lay bare, the true state of the soul. Honest self-reflection may in the long run earn us peace of mind, but, again, it's not what many of us think of as the stillness of meditation or the equable serenity that follows. If we are practicing a form of Eastern meditation, we are trying to quiet the chattering mind, not arouse it. Ancient Stoic meditation is obviously a different species. It's discursive, it's self-judging, it's disciplined and aspirational, it sets the bar high for striving and insists on markers for evaluating progress. Whether day or night, the method requires talk, even if silent talk. The practice is intensely cognitive. It requires the work of a busy mind. The Stoics don't offer hard empirical evidence for their methods. They are empiricists in the sense that Aristotle was in doing ethics. They survey the phenomena around them and the practices and beliefs, as Aristotle puts it, of the many and the wise. What the Stoics see is that the many try to get joy from short-lived enticements, from the highs of election campaigns and crowds of supporters, from applause and acclamation, from a display of erudition that feeds on accolades and prizes. But all that, urges Seneca, costs you great anxiety, solicitude, both to get and to retain. Anxiety is not from moral effort but from misplaced effort. Effort better spent is the road to wisdom and to the serenity and steadiness of joy that is the sign of wisdom. This joy has only one source, a consciousness, conscientia, of one's virtue, that is, the conscientiousness and attention to the habits of the mind that rigorous moral self-examination is meant to afford. Attention is a means. The end goal is certainty in establishing virtue as the only genuine good in life. The Stoics weren't so much interested in how strongly convinced or dogmatic you are in what we believe about your virtue as they were in whether you could rationally and consistently maintain your beliefs in the face of tough tests. Would the beliefs you espouse about temperance hold up if you were challenged by the enticements of real temptation or ease? That consistent, virtuous, error-free view of the world is what constitutes wisdom. It's the achievement of the Stoic sage. And the Stoic sage is rare. The Stoic sage is a kind of ethical and epistemic superbeing, as philosopher Tad Brennan puts it aptly. Serene joy is an equally rarefied moral emotion, in that upper layer of cultivated rational and good emotions reserved, as we saw in Lesson 4, for perfect virtue. Still, the Stoic sage functions as an aspirational touchstone, a model, however remote, of what it might be like to experience calm when we reliably invest in something more meaningful than material riches or a Twitter fanbase. The sage gives us a glimpse at a life free from turbulence. Seneca's metaphor for that moral paradise is equally lofty: a superlunary heaven, a firmament high above the stars, free from clouds and storms. Idealized moral theory never easily applies to real-world conditions, especially if it demands something non-human from humans, namely infallibility. The Stoics are aware of their push to the heavens. Self-examination, Epictetus concedes, may help us escape at least a few faults. We go for progress. In all this, the Stoics inherit Socratic wisdom: the unexamined life is not worth living. John Stuart Mill, the 19th-century British utilitarian, would go on to refine a theory of higher pleasures on the basis of it: better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Higher pleasures derive from activities that exercise our higher capacities. Self-scrutiny is among those activities. I'm thinking about my own habits now. Some nights my self-reflection does take on a Senecan tone. I need to unpack a day, especially if I am upset by a conversation that I might have had with a family member or close friend. Was I too direct? Should I have bitten my tongue? Did I project my own needs rather than listen? Did my anxiety spill out? I need to talk matters through with myself, maybe meditate through journaling. If I am going through a particularly rough patch, then I seek outside counsel and work on issues. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic talk therapy, cognitive and behavioral therapy, the latter, in its origins directly influenced by Stoicism, all have been in the mix. In a safe place, with a trusted therapist, I work through how I see things, what I said and did and showed in response, how I could have responded better, listened better, understood another better, forged a better relationship. Sometimes it's the dynamics of a present relationship that are at the center, other times, the near and distant past creeps in. All that is fair game. The therapy can be short-term or long-term, depending on what's being churned up and the external challenges. Is the process calming? Often, yes. For many, myself included, insight and self-observation can be extremely helpful in working through what causes anxiety and depression, or disappointment and anger. Reframing situations can open up space for more adaptive emotions and behavioral patterns. Obviously, these are not the only kinds of therapeutic interventions. Medication for depression or anxiety, such as SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, have their place. But in their focus on talk, many psychotherapeutic methods owe something to the ancients, and especially the Stoics. Stoic meditation, through talk, is, as they said, a therapia, of the passions. But, again, this isn't what many of us have in mind when we say we meditate. We are typically engaging in some form of Eastern meditation, Buddhist, Hindu, Vedic, Taoist, mindfulness, and so on. Calm comes from letting go, not from searching into every crevice for hidden defects. It comes not from rumination, but from finding a space to silence the chatter. And so, here's another practice. And one I do every morning, and some afternoons, for 20 minutes. It's Vedic meditation, from which transcendental meditation derives. Seated in a comfortable easy chair, with eyes closed, I gently focus on my mantra. As my mind begins to drift into list-making and the business of the day, I favor the mantra, as a teacher put it, using it as a vehicle to focus my mind on something other than the chattering talk. At some point, I'm just in the zone. I can't really tell you where I am, but I lose track of time, my head falls to my chest a bit, and I feel remarkably relaxed. I don't set a timer, but check a clock. By now, a few years into the practice, I have a fairly good sense of when 20 minutes is up. I then take about 2 minutes to ease my way out of the meditation, with my eyes closed. The result, I feel like I have been washed over with a calm that's remarkably restorative. An afternoon meditation is sometimes even more peaceful. The whirl and spin of a busy day stops for a while. And I get recharged. There is some supporting medical and neurobiological science. And I dip into it on occasion. But what I go on, by and large, is my own self-report. I feel better for meditating. And as a result, like daily exercise, eating healthy, and lifting weights, it's become part of my habit. Do we have to choose between meditation practices of the East and West? I see little reason why, other than the fact that life is short and that as with any use of our time, we should make wise choices on the basis of the best information, and in this case, what seems effective for living well. Consider, for example, Shami Sheth, a young medical doctor with the National Health Service, in practice outside London, with a special interest in elderly care. He came to Stoicism in the wake of a personal crisis. One book and podcast led to another, then journaling, and soon a dive into Stoic texts. On the face of it, Stoicism sounds inherently quite dull, he confessed, but all the same, it was the start of the bug. I just adored the simplicity and the practical side of it. His spiritual journey, like that of many, draws on an eclectic blend of sources. Born and raised in England in the Jainist faith, an ancient Indian religion with close ties to Buddhism, he never was really religious, though his parents were. But he studied Buddhism, attended a 10-day silent retreat, and came to experience, he tells me, the real magic in the silence behind the chattering mind. It was powerful. Purgative. I felt unburdened. I wasn't trying to guide myself. I was trying to empty the noise. Stoicism offers something different that appeals to his more analytic side and resonates with philosophical studies that were part of his medical degree at University College, London. While as a doctor he's focused on results and medically proven interventions, as a student of Stoicism he has come to accept that there is a lot that's outside his control. Many of the patients he helps aren't the ones that return for visits to the office. Those who come back are often the ones who aren't improving or whose needs aren't otherwise being met. For some, the problems aren't just about physical health, but have more to do with social and emotional challenges. Stoicism has opened a window for him to see patients in a more holistic way, and to appreciate that doctoring is often about being an empathetic coach, helping patients to build better life habits. Good doctoring is the model for what the Stoics call the art of living. By that they mean the goal in life is to do the very best we possibly can, even though, like the skill of the best doctor, it doesn't guarantee the preferred outcome, long life, and enduring health. Personal journeys, like Shami's, mix Stoicism and Eastern practices. Some modern Stoics are keen to underscore the points of convergence. Take Tibetan Buddhism and Stoicism. Both focus on freedom from cravings and anxious attachments, spiritual journeys, and mentors who proffer inspirational wisdom. Both view benevolence as an important part of enlightenment. Both view enlightenment as waking up from the stupor of false values. Both teach that we are limited by what we choose as our models and what we focus on as possible. One modern Buddhist theorist pictures layers of realms we live in or imagine, If some parts of California and Australia spring to mind as the realm of the gods, you can see the demigod realm being acted out every day, perhaps in the intrigue and rivalry of Wall Street, or in the seething corridors of Washington and Whitehall. And the hungry ghost realms? They exist wherever people, though immensely rich, are never satisfied, craving to take over this company or that one, or endlessly playing out their greed in court cases. This is from Sogyal Rinpoche's The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. But we could imagine a modern Stoic painting a similar image. Not surprisingly, philosophical teachings that look at human craving, hypocrisy, and ambition have content overlap. But the foundations of the two philosophical schools couldn't be more different. The Stoics don't posit as fundamental, in the way Buddhists do, the notion that all things in this world are ephemeral or that wisdom requires a robust detachment from self, a personal selflessness or emptiness that liberates you from the busyness of words and discourse and quiets a mind for insight into a deeper reality. The Stoics invest heavily in the self and its reason. Therapy of the emotions is engagement of reason. Cicero says, "Row the oars of dialectic, if you are to transform the soul." The Stoics follow that lead. You meditate by argument and by engagement with rival philosophical schools, whether skeptics, Epicureans, Platonists, Aristotelians, or others. You coin new terms and concepts to be able to carve the world at new joints. Neologisms are not just an exercise in theory. They are aimed at practice and self-transformation. Change, for the Stoics, is at the granular level, noticing what you notice and what you ignore, what impressions you assent to. That act of assenting is forming beliefs and emotions. Stoic meditation is effortful attention that engages reason and keeps a mind busy. Relearn how to properly live, in the classroom. To relearn how to properly live is how Dobby Herayon describes Stoic teaching. He's a higher education leader in Missouri, who happened upon Stoicism a few years ago through a philosophy podcast. It was nothing short of a spiritual awakening. It put him at a crossroads, he says in all earnestness, hovering between this way of life and that. It humbled him and quieted a temper too easy sparked. I fell in love with Stoicism. I study it. I read it every day. He quoted me lines from Epictetus, Seneca, Musonius Rufus, and others. He now has a mission to train character through Stoicism. To not use Stoicism, especially in this time of transition, would be almost unjust. Dobby is African American and lives just a few blocks from Ferguson, where Michael Brown, an 18-year-old unarmed black man, was fatally shot by a police officer in August 2014. The killing sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. We spoke just a few days after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Ferguson exploded again. Like his neighbors who were part of massive protests, then and now, Dobby, too, urgently wants justice and change. But the front lines for him are not on the streets, but in the classroom. He has teamed up with another practicing Stoic, Bob Simba, a middle school and high school English teacher, also based in St. Louis. Together they've co-founded Behavior Mods, an ethics and behavioral curricula supplement for K-12. I grew up as a Christian, Bob told me. He majored in philosophy as an undergraduate. The honesty of Marcus's self-meditations really spoke to me, and especially, the plea to be strict with yourself and lenient with others. Together, they are piloting their program in the St. Louis neighborhoods near where they teach. In one scenario with young elementary school children, they place a bowl full of candy on a desk behind a curtain. Students line up, and are invited, one by one, to help themselves to the sweets. They have to decide unobserved what's the appropriate amount to take, said Bob. The scenario may bring to mind psychologist Walter Miskel's famous marshmallow test exposing a 4-year-old to a cruel dilemma. A choice between a small reward, one mini marshmallow, that is sitting in front of her, along with a bell that the child could ring at any time to call in the experimenter, or a larger reward, 2 mini marshmallows, that will be offered to her if she can wait 15 minutes. The experimenters watched through a one-way mirror to see how a child either resisted temptation without any toys or books to distract her, or rang the bell, ate the reward, or maybe showed signs of distress while waiting. Miskel's test is about willpower and allocation of attention away from a tempting reward. In follow-up studies, Miskel discovered that the longer a child could wait, the better she would fare later in life, academically or professionally, and more generally, in terms of being healthier and happier. Self-regulation early on is a powerful predictor over the life course. Bob and Dobby are not experimental psychologists designing a study about thought and deferred gratification. They're interested in character training. Bob sees the simulation as teaching temperance. Dobby sees it as teaching equity. A student has taken more than her fair share. "Well, how do you react to it?" asks Dobby. One student gets mad. Another one says, "I'm gonna yada yada yada." Maybe another starts picking on a student who was at the front of the line. They're real-life situations. Real reactions. We create a moment of pause to let the students see how they are reacting to the situations, Dobby says. So, when they leave the school setting, and they go home and their neighbor steals their bike or their mom doesn't get them the shoes they want, they have practiced a different type of behavioral response. They'll feel the onset of anger, explains Dobby. But what we don't want to do is let the anger take them down a path that, 1, they've been used to going down and that, 2, is uncontrollable once they've gone astray. Seneca's teaching in on anger is background here. The first mental agitation induced by the impression of wrong done is no more anger than is the impression itself. The impulse that follows, which not only registers but confirms the impression, is what counts as anger. Seneca, as we saw in Lesson 4, has a view of ordinary emotions, like anger, as chosen actions. Anger is a movement generated by decision that can be eliminated by decision. What these Stoic-inspired teachers are trying to teach is control at that pivotal first moment of decision, the assent to an evaluative impression. It's that assent to an impression of having been cheated in the case of these young kids, that gets the impulse of anger going. Of course, fast reactions to impressions often serve us well. These are the mental operations of what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1, the automatic system. They enable us to detect hostility in a voice, make a disgust face when shown a horrible picture, and orient to the source of a sudden sound. Seneca describes similar sorts of automatic arousals, recoiling at the touch of slimy things or showing a sudden glint in the eyes at the sight of an unexpected threat, as examples of pre-emotional responses that don't impugn even a sage's behavior. But as Kahneman argues, while some quick responses are fine unchecked, others that distort or bias need to be monitored by what he calls System 2, the more effortful system. We operate routinely with both systems. When System 1 runs into difficulty, it calls on System 2 to support more detailed and specific processing. In essence, Bob and Dobby are trying to open up space for System 2's more effortful monitoring. They're teaching young children how to pause so they recognize charged impressions that can lead to impulsive emotional behavior, like a greedy grab or thirst for payback, and how to find room to explore alternative ways of seeing, feeling, and reacting. Exemplars and heroes. Model the behavior of exemplars. If you need a model, take Socrates. Would you like a second model? Take the younger Cato, Seneca writes to Lucilius. Learn what to do from someone who is already doing it. The Roman Stoics teach by argument, but also by example. And the examples abound, despite the privileging of Socrates and Cato as the preeminent figures who stood up to fortune's assaults. Cicero boasts that while the Greeks had just a modest list of exemplars of courage and temperance, the Romans far outstripped the Greeks in their exemplars. Exemplary material is inexhaustible, he crows, in history and in the present. A later Roman rhetorician, Quintilian, amplifies the boast. The Greeks may have had precepts, but the Romans produce more striking examples of moral performance. The tradition of moralizing through examples is central to Roman moral experience. Seneca relies on it regularly in his letters, consolations, and plays. He turns to history for raw material, but also to daily life to set an example and a model for moral guidance. Examples becomes patterns for imitation and emulation. They are more direct than precepts or dialectical arguments. They cut to the chase. Formal discourse will not do as much for you, he writes to Lucilius, but direct contact, speaking in person, sharing a meal. You must come and see me. Learning by precepts is the long way around. The quick and effective way is to learn by example. He then lists how Cleanthes was molded by Zeno, how Plato and Aristotle derived more from Socrates' conduct than from his words, how Epictetus influenced his disciples not so much by formal instruction as by companionship and community. In the case of a living example and mentorship, There is the added benefit of mutual growth. If wisdom were given to me with this proviso, that I should keep it shut up in myself and never express it to anyone else, he confides to Lucilius, I should refuse it. No good is enjoyable to possess without a companion. Stoic mentors show you what's possible to endure, as in Stockdale's remarkable courage under fire as a POW in Vietnam for more than 7 years. Lucilius is encouraged to focus on examples of the mighty who have fallen, a Pompey or a Caligula, in order to grasp that losses afflict even the most powerful. You face your own future by contemplating the fate of others. If it can happen at all, it can happen today. Examples to follow and avoid, moral deterrents as well as moral guides, decayed and privileged examples, and those that have been forgotten or too long hidden are all part of how we learn by example. In an unwitting way, when I was the ethics chair at the U.S. Naval Academy, I helped keep alive the story of a man of remarkable moral courage whom the Army had once tried to forget. It was the spring of 1998, 30 years after the My Lai massacre, in which a group of U.S. Army soldiers tortured and killed some 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, many women and children and Buddhist priests. Hugh Thompson was the 25-year-old Army helicopter pilot who, with his 18-year-old door gunner, Lawrence Corbin, and his 22-year-old crew chief, Glenn Andriotta, landed his helicopter that day and stopped the massacre, likely preventing the massive slaughter of hundreds more. I invited Thompson to speak at the Naval Academy. I knew something of his story, but I also knew that initially the Army had tried to cover up the massacre and that some in Congress at the time had urged him to be punished. What was his crime? When he landed his helicopter, he gave his crew the order, if the GIs try to stop me, open up on them and kill them. It was time to stop the madness, he said to himself, even if he risked court-martial. Leaving the helicopter with just a sidearm, he put himself between Lieutenant William Kaye and Captain Ernest Medina, and the civilians. They were marching out of a bunker into a ditch already teeming with bodies. Kaye and Medina did not open fire. I taught with many Navy and Marine retired senior officers who had served in Vietnam. We were committed to teaching midshipmen about the massacre and about the example of an officer who put his career on the line to stop an atrocity. The lecture was an academy-wide event, but also open to the public. I somewhat naively advertised the evening as featuring Hugh Thompson, the hero of My Lai. I got a flood of inflammatory emails from those in the greater military community who told me that no service member who gave an order like his could be called a hero. I had my examples wrong. The night of the event came. Thompson gave his talk, followed by a Q&A. A Vietnam vet, from outside the academy, stood up, and seething with rage, demanded how Thompson could possibly have given an order to turn on fellow soldiers. It was treason, he implied. Thompson kept his calm and gave his reasons. Other questions followed and Thompson was equally composed. At the end of the talk, that angry veteran went up to the stage and in tears embraced Thompson, with the words, "Welcome home, bro." We all watched. We didn't know how it was going to play out. Reconciliations of that sort don't always happen. Thompson was a hunted and haunted man for a long time. The Army wanted to forget him and blot out the stain of the atrocities. It took 30 years, that same spring, for the Army finally to recognize Thompson and his crew's moral courage with the Soldier's Medal awarded to Thompson and his crew at the Vietnam War Memorial. Would Thompson's example figure among the exemplars in a modern Stoicism? Would an updated, retold tale of Seneca's letters to Lucilius include Thompson? It's an odd thought experiment. How would you recreate the sort of motives that prompt Seneca's own selection of examples, driving home a point, emulation, deterrence, but also flattery and rhetorical ornament? Still, I reflected on something similar when I came to write Stoic Warriors about my years at the Naval Academy and the Stoic culture of the military. I was struggling with the Stoic view of anger. It was an emotion, Seneca argued, that would run rampant if given license. It was too dangerous an emotion to allow in any form. There were better ways to motivate justice than through anger, he insisted. Whetting a warrior's appetite with anger can unleash payback and revenge, precisely the sort of venom that motivated the GIs of the Charlie Company who carried out the My Lai massacre. They wanted payback for buddies who had been killed by mines and booby traps. It was time to get even. That may be, but Thompson's courage that morning in March 1968 stood as a vivid counterexample to me. Here was someone whose anger set him in motion, but who then acted with restraint and justice and courage to stop the atrocity. Non-violent resistance is not a part of armed warfare. But restraint is. Thompson exited his helicopter with only a sidearm. He was not looking for payback, but a way to rescue innocent civilians who were being murdered. I kept thinking about Thompson as I was writing Stoic Warriors, and so invited him to speak again, at Georgetown this time. It was now 2002, 4 years after we had first met. Would he be willing to be interviewed by me before the talk? He was fine with that, and so we settled down to talk in my office for an hour or so before the lecture. As he started recalling that morning in my lie, tears welled up in his eyes. "Don't make me break down," he said softly. I insisted several times that we could stop. But he wanted to keep talking. It was important, he told me. He relived the morning of March 16, 1968. He couldn't make sense of his initial impressions as he hovered over the village during routine reconnaissance. Earlier in the morning, there had been no sign of enemy action and no reports of Americans hurt. But now, just an hour later, flying over the same site, he and his crew began to see a swath of devastation and a ditch piled high with bodies. His mind began to go places it didn't want to go. "I guess I was in denial," he said to me. "You've got to understand, we were ready to risk our lives to save these American guys on the ground." And so, he began to construct alternative scenarios for what he was seeing. Maybe the carnage was from an earlier morning aerial artillery. But why then the ditch? He tried out another scenario. Maybe when the artillery started coming, the enemy ran out into the ditch and a lucky artillery round got them. But every house has a bomb shelter. When artillery is coming, why are you going to leave this safe bomb shelter and take a walk in the park? Maybe the Americans did the humane thing, he thought to himself. They dug a mass ditch for the enemy dead caught in the artillery raid. But then he looked again at the ditch. Everybody isn't dead. Wait a minute. We don't put the living with the dead in a grave. He then settled on what he was afraid to think. These people were marched down in that damn ditch and murdered. And then he saw the Americans marching out others from their shelters into the ditch. At this point, he radioed for help but got little uptake on the other end. His pleas for help had somehow gotten garbled and were misconstrued as warnings about a threat, and so resulted in delay and more killings, though in hindsight, he now knows better. The messages weren't mangled but ignored. As he witnessed killings, the anger started to brew. I was hot. I'll tell you that. I was hot. I had had enough. Damn it, it ain't gonna happen. They ain't gonna die. I could still see and hear traces of the outrage. He was controlled but emotional. But he also didn't forswear the anger that motivated him then to stop the slaughter. The time for the lecture came. We walked to the auditorium, filled with Georgetown students and some young cadets and midshipmen from the DC area. He told them about my lie, what he saw, and how he viewed GIs on the ground that morning as the real enemy. He then told them about returning to Vietnam some years back. He went to the village that was the site of the killing field. A frail, aging woman rushed up to meet him. She had survived the massacre by playing dead in the ditch. He remembered her. He smiled gently as she looked up at him, imploring, "Why didn't the people who committed the murder come back with you?" She finished her thought without pause, but the interpreter's translation lagged behind. "So that we could forgive them?" This was not at all how Thompson thought the sentence would end. How could this woman have compassion in her heart for someone who is so evil? She's a better person than I am. Mercy, compassion, the possibility of reigning in anger, all were on display at that moment in this survivor's question. And this is told to us by a man who had earlier said what motivated him to rescue that women and others like her was fury. Call it moral indignation, call it moral outrage. It was still anger. Would a Stoic permit it? The Stoics don't believe that injuries others inflict are serious wrongs. Anger is always mistaken as a motive, so they can't really help us here. Acting on principle is what they offer instead. But clearly that won't do. It would be hard to imagine Thompson remaining calm once he accepted the true horrors of what he saw. Perhaps we should give his anger a special term, transitional anger, as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum does, to mark the fact that Thompson wasn't focused on retaliation but amelioration, rescue of innocence. He wasn't wishing ill on the offenders. If anger comes with the idea of payback, then that isn't what motivated Thompson's actions. Still, Thompson came to view what Kaye and his unit did that day as evil. And he wasn't ready to forgive them without atonement on their part. Teaching by example, on its own, is always inadequate. It is a jumping-off point for analysis and context, question and examination. We are inspired by examples, but we need to know what we are emulating and why. And in the case of Stoic models of courage, we need to be ready to question Stoicism's own account of moral motivation. Anger may sometimes take us down the right path and one we might not otherwise go down if we accept with calm what we see. A dance and a game of catch. Ancient and modern Stoics can seem far too self-absorbed. As daily meditation, the art of Stoic living is a way of looking inward to control what's outward. Examine yourself morning and night, pre-rehearse, set your fears, arm yourself for the assault of life's challenges. Be prepared. Anticipate. These are lessons we've been exploring. But it can sound like fortress building. Learn to be undisturbed not just by knowing what you can and can't control, but by fortifying the boundary between you and what's outside. And yet, we've argued throughout, the Stoics urge a socially engaged and connected life. They urge a fellowship of moral learners and a view of humanity as deeply shared and cooperative. That is key to our resilience. And it is key to our flourishing. But if that's so, then how is meditation and the mental effort of noticing and being aware not just about me, but about others and the give and take of our relationships? The question is at the heart of Seneca's explorations in On Favus. Exchanges of goodwill and gratitude depend on noticing attitude and the emotional overlays of the exchange. Is there any virtue which we Stoics respect more or do more to stimulate? Is there anyone better fitted to encourage it than we are with our stress on the sanctity of human fellowship? His essay is aptly addressed to one liberalis. But we soon learn that liberality or generosity doesn't depend on grandeur or magnificence. The attitude expressed, and not the size or glitter of the gift, is key. The mind is what raises small things high, casts luster on dingy things, discredits things that are great and valued. Attitude is expressed, Seneca goes on to tell us, through emotions. And so, the art of Stoic living, not surprisingly, includes lessons in emotional expression, how to show feelings, including how to fake them at times, and how to detect them in others. This is a strange preoccupation for a Stoic, we might muse. But not really. The Stoics are counselors of the emotions and emotional behavior, teaching how to shift cognitive focus to begin to loosen disappointment and grief, or, in the case at hand, express and read generosity or its absence. The Stoics see strong shades of will in what we show on our faces or express in the intonations in our voice. By paying heed to the nuances of emotional expression, we become better in taking on the many roles, personae, we play in life. Sometimes, like good actors, we get to choose the plays that are most suited to our talents, Cicero notes. Other times, we have to work with whatever roles we are given. In gift giving, says Seneca, we should watch how others see us. The gift was great, but he hesitated, he put it off, he groaned as he gave it haughtily, he flaunted it about, it was not the beneficiary he wished to please, he did it for his ambition, not for me. We spoiled a favor by silence, or with a look of reluctance. Premeditate, next time, on the impressions we leave and what we pick up in others' comportment. Cicero gives similar advice. We can judge fitting actions from a glance of the eyes, from the relaxation or contraction of an eyebrow, from a raising or lowering of the voice, and so on. These views about emotional signaling are precursors to theories that would come some 2,000 years later, in Darwin's seminal work on the expression of emotions and more contemporary research on facial expression by Irving Goffman, Paul Ekman, and Wallace Friesen, among others. Conferring gifts, Seneca teaches, requires emotions expressed aptly, and attunement to the responses. Gift-giving and gratitude are a kind of dance, he says, pointing to the three graces or muses, who joining hands in a circle, give, accept, and return in a smooth, coordinated movement. There is a sequence of kindness, passing from one hand to another, which comes back nonetheless to the giver, and that the beauty of the whole is lost if the sequence is anywhere interrupted. Think of dancers in a corps de ballet, say in Swan Lake. The ensemble moves as one mass as each dancer's sequenced movement undulates from one body to another. There's connectivity. No gap. We have seen that the Stoics, and especially Marcus in his visceral battlefield image of body parts, appeals to the ideal of organic human connection. Exchanges of goodwill are like a game of catch, Seneca illustrates with a different image. A good player needs to send it off differently to a tall partner than to a short one. If you want the ball to be caught, you gauge the pitch to the catcher, so it has a better chance of being caught and returned. If you are a coach, or a parent in the playground teaching your child, you tailor the game not only to the height of the young catcher, but to the skill level, and from there nudge progress along. If a game of catch is not just about skill, but all the other things that go into play, fun, frustration, and the need for encouragement and support, then the game is also a moment for the parent to read emotions, and for the child to manage them. Contemplating the subtle contours of emotional exchange is not the usual fare of modern Stoic practice. Modern Stoics talk more about life hacks to beat fear or disappointment, rejection or grief. Self-improvement, personal development, is what I hear often from those who turn to Stoicism for spiritual guidance. But the ancient Stoics always viewed doing well or flourishing as a social project, both in how it is achieved and what its content is. Living virtuously is how we live well with others. Seneca's claim is that social fellowship is finely textured, a matter of noticing a furrowed brow, an air of arrogance, a groan, hesitation, or on the positive side, the warmth of a smile or a shared laugh. We now know from developmental psychologists that from early infancy onward we track gestures and teach ourselves resilience, trust, and mutual love through them. We orient ourselves in the world to what's safe or dangerous by being exquisite readers of countless muscles in the face. The blind track through other senses. Part of being at home in the world, oikesis, that basic Stoic notion of lifelong development and social orientation, Seneca is now saying, requires reading the signs of goodwill and when it's missing. We are mind readers, reading intention through emotional signs and signals. You cannot have a favor if the best part of it is missing, the judgment that went into it. The modern philosopher P.F. Strawson echoes the point. We should consider in how much of our behavior the benefit or injury resides mainly or entirely in the manifestation of attitude itself. Seneca's teaching is that the presentation of attitude may itself have an element of practice. Attitude is manifest in emotions, some candid, some performed, some nursed so that we might come to feel what we show. It may take labor. Seeing emotions is another way of noticing and paying attention. It is a form of attention directed not inward, but outward at others with whom we share the world. Lesson 9. A healthy modern Stoicism. A final most unlikely test. Cyclist versus deer. That was the heading on the medical report the nurse handed me. A final test had come as I was finishing this book, and I hadn't exactly pre-rehearsed this event. My husband Marshall was cycling in Rock Creek Park not far from our home when a deer couldn't make up its mind which way to cross the road. It started one way, got almost to the other side, saw a car coming, and then turned back and crossed the road again. My husband and the deer collided. The deer got away injury-free. My husband ended up with 7 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a dislocated shoulder. He took a really bad beating, an ER doc told me, as I became faint hearing the news. We're going to have to take him to a trauma center in DC. COVID was raging here. My husband and I had taken all precautions and were essentially in lockdown for 5 months. And now we were headed to a big city hospital. What should I think, as a Stoic? Epictetus was whispering in my ear, "It's only his body." You've got to be joking, I'm thinking. His brain is his body. We have friends who are doctors, helping me understand flailed chests, pneumonia threats, pulmonary functions, neurological issues, what to watch out for cognitively. Any cognitive deficits, they're asking? Only his body? Stockdale may have had his leg pummeled as a downed Navy aviator now in enemy hands, and then was tortured as a POW for more than 7 years. He found his salvation in Epictetus, a once enslaved Stoic and fellow cripple. But my husband wasn't a POW. And the enemy I had been worried about of late was a vicious virus that we were doing our best to smartly fight. I wasn't thinking about his body taking a hit from an indecisive deer. A bad beating kept racing through my head. I had been focused all week in thinking about brutal beatings of enslaved Romans and Stoic commentary. The Stoics famously minimize pain of the body. But they also blur the distinction between what you suffer due to bad luck and what you suffer due to others' injustice. Getting hit by a deer, when you're a careful and conscientious cyclist, is bad luck. Being flogged or tortured as an enslaved person is nothing other than injustice. Seneca famously rails against brutality toward enslaved Romans. But it's more self-serving than rooted in a defense of humanity. Those who are enslaved can turn on those who enslave them. Better to have them be grateful than afraid. Do them a favor, and they may return one, including the favor of taking your place in death. Suppose I show you someone fighting for his master's safety without regard for his own, riddled with wounds yet pouring out from his very entrails what blood is left there and seeking, so as to give his master time to escape, a respite for him at the cost of his own life. The moral lesson is that enslaved persons are capable of benevolence. The political lesson for the intended audience, the elite who are Seneca's peers, is that it pays to curb your anger when contemplating flogging your servant. The body, its integrity and its pain, a person and the respect due their humanity, were not part of either lesson. We are all enslaved to external powers, the Stoics teach. But they also teach that some of us have more worldly power than others. Morality is one thing, legality and social reality another. The Stoics never challenge the institution of enslavement. This sets us up for a final reckoning. How do we build a healthy modern Stoicism on the foundation of ancient Greek and Roman culture? In the current cancel culture with monuments of oppression toppling, why consort with ancient philosophers who not only condoned enslavement but celebrated inner freedom as the most noble kind of liberation? Diogenes the Cynic, an iconic figure for the Stoics, may have cross-dressed, showed off body parts in public, and spurned marriage as a convention, but however unconventional, he didn't argue against the convention of enslavement, even though himself enslaved. He looked for a different kind of freedom and mastery. Hence, his brazen quip on the auction block as he pointed to a Corinthian in the crowd, "Sell me to this man, he needs a master." Inner mastery was the real liberation. Epictetus, the most famous of enslaved Stoics, became well-educated and a teacher with scores of followers, including an emperor. But he never argued against the institution of enslavement. If flogging an enslaved person was morally objectionable, the evil was in the degradation of the person in power, not in the degradation of the person flogged. In a similar vein, his teacher Musonius Rufus taught that the problem with adulterous sex with an enslaved woman is weakness of will on the part of the male adulterer, not any unjust treatment toward the woman. The true power of an enslaved person is spiritual independence of fortune and assault. Weak control of desire is the sin, whether it is consorting with an enslaved woman, or a married or unmarried woman consorting with an enslaved man. There's gender equity here, but the real sin, a weak will, is worse in a man. Enslavement is universal. We are all hostages to fortune and the cravings of our bodies. Freedom is also universal. We all share in humanity and reason. Contrary to what Aristotle taught, the Stoics took it as near cliché that enslavement has no basis in nature. We are in a community of common origin and common fate. That may be. But equality of spirit is not equality of everyday social reality. Seneca, for a good part of his life, lived in opulence. His retinue of enslaved house servants would make Downton Abbey look understaffed. The Stoics invest in community and reliance on others for strength. But in practice, that reliance isn't always benign. Your body, preaches Epictetus, is like a poor overburdened ass weighted down with its own pack saddles and bridles. It's a tool that can get pressed into public service. Don't resist or mutter, otherwise you will get a beating. This is the enslaved person's side of the bargain. So, as we conclude these lessons in modern Stoicism, I show my hand, if it hasn't been already. I teach and write about ancient and modern ethics. I adore texts, I pore over them, I argue with them, and I insist that my students read them carefully and argue hard with them. I am not an orthodox Stoic, whatever that could mean for a modern, or just an expositor of texts. I have put myself in the position of a curious and inquisitive neo-Stoic, capturing the best of ancient Stoicism and lessons worthy of a modern Stoicism. In building a healthy modern Stoicism, I've implicitly adopted certain principles as background guides. 1. Psychological mastery can't be at the cost of human vulnerability. 2. Reliance on others depends upon building communities of cooperation, respect, and support. 3. Denying pain, whether of a body or mind, is not a permanent solution for grit. 4. Monitoring quick impressions includes watching for distortions and bias produced by fear and anger, as well as desire. For each of these principles, I have shown how we get footholds in Stoic texts, some to do with the multi-layers of emotions, others with notions of empathy and global human connectedness, still others to do with psychological and moral distress and the role of compassion in healing, and yet others with the role of effortful attention. I have been respectful of the texts. But I also have let them talk to us, and have allowed us to talk to them and question them and consider new applications. Still, we haven't had a proper reckoning with the Stoics on the institution of enslavement. In a time of our own reckoning with our history of enslavement, we need to. How do we assess a modern Stoicism in the age of Black Lives Matter? Seneca's remarks are our focus, and in particular, his 47th letter. Although modern scholars once took his remarks there as enlightened and an ancient underpinning of contemporary humanistic thinking, it is now generally regarded as quite the opposite. Seneca may have pleaded a powerful case for the humane treatment of those who were enslaved, but more out of expediency than social conscience. The institution of enslavement was critical to the Roman elite. As imperial advisor to Nero, Seneca's emphasis was squarely on acceptance of the status quo. They are slaves. No, they are human beings. So Seneca opens his letter to Lucilius on how to treat enslaved servants in your household. He continues in rapid volley with his alter ego, they are slaves. No, they are housemates. They are slaves. No, they are lowborn friends. The next salvo delivers the pivotal moral lesson, they are slaves. Fellow slaves, rather if you keep in mind that fortune has its way with you just as much as with them. You are born of the same seeds. Disasters can lay highborn nobles low. Shared fortune and shared humanity are equalizers. Still, the highborn noble employs, and the enslaved is a tool, as Aristotle had said, even if now, for the Stoics, tools by convention and chance only. And a tool for what? To wipe up spit and vomit at banquets, to carve the expensive fowl and carry the cup of wine, to serve drinks in public, but cater to lust in private, for he is a boy only at the party, in the bedroom he's the man. He knows this highborn's taste, which foods stimulate his palate, which ones make him queasy, which ones he has a hankering for, which please his eye. He knows with whom he likes to dine, and who is beneath his dignity. It's an intimate knowledge, now catalogued from the side of power, written for a peer group whose habits and household economy depended on enslaved workers. Seneca's own list of household functions for servants went on and on. Cook, baker, masseurs, bath attendant, personal trainer, majordomo, chief steward. Ostentatious households, like his, would have had, in addition, hairdressers, guest announcers, valets and chambermaids, porters and ushers, litter-bearers, those who restrained the sick and insane. You depended on the enslaved help from waking moments to the meditative hours of night. You needed them for the business of a gentrified daily life, inside the house to meet every whim and need and outside the house to tend to the garden and lands. It is no surprise that fugitive slaves are almost an obsession in the sources. Slave owners did not suffer such loss of property lightly. To lose an enslaved worker was a major disruption in household lifestyle and economy. Seneca may be meditating at night on how to curb rage at a household servant, precisely because flogging an enslaved worker who makes too much noise at dinner or who disturbs the landowner when he is working on his household accounts, or, closer to home, his self-account when the light has been taken away and my wife has fallen silent, was not at all unusual. Rehearsing restraint, at bedtime or morning meditations, might mean the enslaved person won't run away, or turn on you in an inquisition under brutal torture. This is the social setting of humane treatment of enslaved Romans in Seneca's milieu. It's an accommodation to convention. The moral setting is nobler, we are all enslaved. Show me who isn't. One person is a slave to lust, another to greed, a third to ambition, and all are slaves to hope, all are slaves to fear. Enslavement is a mental state. And a shared one at that. So don't look for friends only in the forum or in the Senate House. They are in your backyard and in your household. A person's clothing or position in life is no indication of their true freedom. It is the mind that should be free. This is both the attraction of Stoicism and its pernicious side. Throughout this book, I have tried to turn the modern Stoic outward, realizing the promise of belonging in the world, connectedness, and shared reason and humanity. And I have widened the angle of will and attention so that they monitor a wider range of impressions that affect our well-being, or eudaimonia. This is the full promise of Stoicism and its Socratic inheritance, to examine and cross-examine ourselves about what we take to be the goods and bads in the world. For the Stoics, false goods and bads have to do with the externals, or indifference, what is outside the genuine good of rationality and its perfection in virtue. But the Stoics never make rationality indifferent to external resources. Quite to the contrary, wisdom is in selecting or preferring those goods that are, for the most part, in accord with nature. They are what we would take: health over disease, sufficient material means over penury, good children and friends over those who are evil. Those preferences, and how we express them in the messy world of action, are the concrete manifestation of our virtue. Reason and its excellence or perfection are the genuine good because they are fundamental to our collective well-being. We obviously can't control all outcomes, but we can cultivate reason, curiosity, a respect for the truth, and a belief that everyone deserves adequate resources to cultivate reason. That is the Stoic seed, even if not sown in their own times. So, in constructing a modern Stoicism, can Stoicism meet the challenge? Kant, in the European Rational Enlightenment, begins the work. He develops the notion of reason as shared. It becomes the foundation of moral law that we, and not gods or nature or the cosmos, create. It binds us and is the source of moral obligations and duties that hold universally, without exemptions based on expedience or self-interest. Kant crafts a powerful principle of humanity to block treating persons as mere means with price tags, even though his writings, penned almost 2 millennia after Seneca's, are no pure model for emancipation for all human beings. Texts and contexts. So how do we deal with texts that have morally troubling strands? Do we expunge those bits? Do we choose not to teach them or, more radically, banish that author's work as a whole? Or do we try to do what the Stoics themselves teach in their better moments, show judgment and flexibility to meet the challenges? I choose the latter. In the case at hand, the challenges are understanding times different from our own and views influenced, sometimes far too heavily, by those historical frames. Philosophy is never ahistorical, even if it pretends to be. Even when it takes the view from nowhere, it's written from the ground, by flesh and blood humans, influenced by and often reacting to their culture and practices and predecessors. Philosophy prides itself as the discipline of argument. But its practice is never just pure argument. It's a discipline that gathers followers and faithful, disciples, like those who met in Athens, in the cool of a fresco-lined portico, or in the gymnasium of the Lyceum, or the Academy. Still, the Roman Stoics are a different breed of philosopher from Aristotle and Plato, or even the ancient Greek Stoics who met at that colonnaded portico. They argue, but they also preach and sermonize. That has been part of their enduring historic appeal. And it is again, behind the great Stoic revival. Stoic philosophy can be a secular religion, a spiritual practice focused on goodness and moral progress without the accretions of establishment religion. Historically, the direction of influence obviously went the other way. Early Judeo-Christian thinkers absorbed some of the pagan philosophy. That, in part, is why Stoicism remains so deeply familiar to many of us. Its theories about emotional control and mustering will to guard against temptation and sudden impulse or impressions, all this appealed to earlier Western religious thinkers. They used Stoicism to interpret sacred texts and guide moral progress. Stoicism brings, in its own right, a tradition not of worship, but of meditative practice. While Stoic meditation is not the stilling of the chattering mind familiar from Eastern practices, it is meant, in the end, to help find calm in dealing with the big and not so big challenges of everyday life. It's a discipline of prudence, not fear, where prudence, somehow, isn't obsessive. The promise is tranquility. The way forward. We are living in anxious times. Our conception of politics has become upended. Our democracy is threatened. Our control of disease has been tested. Economic, social, and health inequities rip open the sin of enslavement and the legacy of Jim Crow America. There is moral outrage in the streets. Unemployment is at its highest since the Great Depression. All this makes it hard to know how to go forward. We need leaders, we need education, we need science, and we need greater equity. The Stoics can't help us with all of that. They can give us solace in some corners, lessons about our mortality, life hacks for facing fears, ways to manage disabling emotions, better ways to be prepared for sudden shifts in fortune, a sense of connectedness that supports resilience, the place of benevolence and gratitude in our lives. Cultivating humanity, Seneca's rallying call, is an unfinished business. What we need to do is not just soul repair, but social repair. Some things are up to us and others not. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. These are Epictetus's familiar teachings. But we can't accept the historical fact of Epictetus's enslavement to justify our own retreat. That is cowardice, given who we are, our times, and the profound moral and political challenges we face. What we cannot accept, we have to change. And we have to change it by changing not just us, but the institutions and social structures that frame who we collectively are. It is a social project, requiring social grit and a belief in the unity of humanity. That's what Marcus envisioned on the battlefield as he beheld its opposite, human beings torn asunder in strewn body parts. That's what happens, he wrote to himself, when you cut yourself off from the community and the well-being of that whole. You make yourself an outcast of humanity. The Stoics warn about the corruption of values, false glory, greed, excessive materialism. Seneca warns about tyrants who demand loyalty. He knows about speechwriters who paper over palace killings, who write about mercy to calm a worried public that the murder of a rival would be the end, not the beginning of more bloodshed. Seneca is that speechwriter and his hands are dirty. His philosophical writings strain with the tensions of power and the fear of losing it, loyalty and its costs, opulence and abstinence. He writes, in part, as prayers for redemption. He writes for freedom. Stoicism is a way to endure and cultivate inner virtue when tight control from outside threatens your very being. It was a philosophy suited for the times. It again feels like a philosophy for the times. But we are moderns. We have much to learn from the ancients. But we also have mistakes to avoid. Stoic discipline and resilience, virtue, and the bonds of reason and rationality can help unite us to face our individual and shared challenges. But only when empathy and mercy course through the veins of reason. That is a way forward. It is a way forward as a healthy modern Stoic. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon for more amazing audiobooks.